This story begins, like so many others, with a boy whose life was a complete mess from the very start. A simple boy with a difficult childhood, and an even tougher mother, who constantly pressured him to learn magic and become a shaman, as if it was the only way to survive. But it all ended tragically. The world he grew up in simply threw him away like a broken toy. So it's no wonder that after all this he was reborn. He found himself in a world where there was no less magic than problems, and somehow became a teacher at a real magic academy. But if you think that's all, you're wrong. This story follows a whole chain of crazy events that led him to this life. And we will soon find out what kind of diabolical puzzle this has become. But don't rush. The road is first. It was an exhausting train ride, and the conversation started somehow unexpectedly, right away about the war. The first to speak was Roger Salisi, a young and charismatic passenger. He admitted that he was going to Leatherwake, to Theon Academy. And his compartment neighbor, Jared, had a different route, the capital of the Empire. We exchanged a few pleasantries and returned to the topic of war, which seemed to never leave our lips. It was rumored that a wandering mercenary named Machiavelli was the one who turned the tide of the battle. Jared wasn't particularly surprised. Well, who hasn't heard another legend about a hero from the shadows these days? But the thing is, it was true. Machiavelli didn't just travel, he searched. One single object. And it wasn't just a name. It was a mask behind which a very important character in our history hid. We'll talk about it later, believe me, it'll be hot. But in the meantime, Jared suddenly felt something strange. The train shuddered, and it became clear that it was a trap. Some scoundrels decided to hit the jackpot by robbing wealthy passengers. Roger, without thinking twice, rushed forward. They had to hide before it was too late. The train had magical protection, so only a true master could break through it. And that's exactly what appeared there. When the men almost reached another car, the attackers struck. But the stranger stood his ground, and then calmly declared that he would kill everyone. And, unfortunately, he wasn't kidding. The bomb on his chest exploded with a roar that even pierced the train's defenses. Jared managed to see Roger, the young professor, fall dead. His body flew into the air and flew out of the car. But the most interesting thing was ahead. The mask that Jared was wearing was damaged. Before us was an incredibly handsome young man who had gotten into something dangerous. There was no particular reason why the hero chose the name Machiavelli. He just needed to completely erase his past, become someone else, disappear from his old life. And this image was supposed to help keep him out of trouble while he roamed the world on his travels. Everything went wrong one of those days when he attracted too much attention. This is exactly the story that Roger and Gerard discussed on the train. Fortunately, when the war ended, the princess and the soldiers were busy with their own victorious euphoria. As soon as they relaxed their vigilance a little, Machiavelli managed to disappear. That's why he got on that fateful train to the capital of the empire. But then things got even stranger. This particular train was ambushed in broad daylight, and it was so professional that it was terrifying. Our hero, I don't know what to call him, Gerard or Machiavelli, definitely didn't expect a bomb to explode right before his eyes, and he will kill the young professor he just spoke to. These weren't just any robbers, they didn't care about taking such risks. And then suddenly the conductor appeared. He seemed normal, even a little scared. He talked about evacuating passengers, but the hero sensed a trick. Something about him was fake. And he was right. It was one of the attackers just waiting to stab him in the back. However, everything was ruined by the sound of a gunshot. The firearm gave a signal. It seems that this imposter had managed to warn his followers, and now the protagonist finds himself face to face with a whole pack of armed scum. But he's not one to break down. With a light movement, he neutralized their weapons, and then, without hesitation, jumped onto the roof of the car. That's where the real magic started. His spells were cut off one by one. Only one survived. He tried to say something but instead received a couple of kind words. The protagonist was already preparing to finish off the scoundrel but didn't have time. She entered the stage, beautiful, cold, and dangerous. Captain of the Knights of Cold Iron Detachment. A detachment of knights instantly dealt with the last robbers. Their skill and reaction were impressive. The train was safe again, and soon everyone arrived at Leatherbeck Station. Captain Veronica DeVille immediately approached the hero. She wanted to make sure he was okay, and simply to find out his name. But a local police officer intervened in the conversation. He didn't like this situation. The attack was too quick. Someone from the passengers was definitely helping the criminals. The police decided to identify each person by conducting a brief interview. The protagonist already understood. It smelled of serious problems. Jared, as a cover, looked flawless. But the mask was ruined, and now he definitely didn't look 45. It was useless to run away, and Captain Veronica does not forgive enemies. The policeman began the interrogation. He wondered where the second passenger from the compartment had gone. The hero answered honestly, he died in an explosion and fell off the train. But something in that answer alarmed the cop. The situation was saved by Veronica. She confirmed that the man was actually fighting the robbers and could not be a traitor. The detective apologized. And then there was the shock. He addressed him as Mr. Roger. This is where things got really interesting. Veronica and the officer immediately mentioned their new position at Theon Academy. The hero had no choice but to confirm that he was the new professor. And he moved on, pretending that everything was under control. Old photos greatly blurred his facial features, and this was his salvation. And at the same time, a trap. Because it was at this moment that the Academy employee recognized the professor. He had to be delivered to Theon now. To refuse is to expose oneself. So there was only one thing left: escape. Later. Theon Academy was truly a special place, and Eliza Veloff, a rector with an equally special character, was already waiting for him. Madame was sincerely glad that the new teacher had survived the terrorist attack. After all, such a loss would have been a blow to the Academy. But Roger Celicia himself was haunted by a certain uneasy feeling that had overcome him as soon as he entered the office. Besides, he had a bunch of questions about the very professor he was impersonating. Fortunately, Eliza Willow did not suspect anything. On the contrary, she enthusiastically talked about all the details of the work. And here the protagonist was really impressed. The conditions were simply luxurious. The salary was like winning the lottery. But there was only one question that haunted him. Would he be able to pretend to be a scientist among geniuses? Roger certainly couldn't refuse such an offer. It would look suspicious. So the only way out was to lie, improvise, and carefully read each interlocutor. Fortunately, this is exactly what the hero was a pro at. All you need to do is hold out for 2 years. And for now, the transformation has begun. I hope you're already wondering who this mysterious guy is. But in reality, everything that is happening now is just an introduction. So let's move on to the period when Roger began his training. There were 3 weeks left until the start of the semester. And although he is new to the academy, he has been a hero in this world for a long time. 27 years to be exact. He was reborn with full memory but without any abilities. Life threw him into the toughest trials, and a teaching career was definitely not in his plans. But fate decided otherwise. And the professor's mask became an excellent cover. The real Roger, by the way, was a former nobleman. He wrote dryly and officially, which meant he had no friends. And this detail suited the hero perfectly. Another week passed and everything went smoothly. But suddenly, in a nearby restaurant, a stranger sat at his table. The young girl looked genuinely relieved to finally see Roger alive. She wondered why he hadn't been in touch for so long, because the entire order was worried. The hero instantly gathered himself and began to improvise. He said he had to check something. At that moment, it became clear that the real Roger was being closely watched and was also called, strangely enough, the First Order. The girl said that even for the Order, the terrorist attack was unexpected, and also something about traitors who were eliminated. The hero just listened silently, not understanding where he had gotten himself into. But it was dangerous to delay. So Celici went on the offensive, speaking sharply, even aggressively. I reprimanded the girl for drawing too much attention to them and almost giving everything away. Judging by her reaction, she was truly afraid of Roger. The protagonist was shaking with anger. How had he not noticed the reason before? Roger's image seemed too perfect, and that's why it inspired trust. This man clearly created such an impeccable reputation on purpose so that he could get into the academy without any questions. And those letters that the hero considered ordinary were apparently encrypted. It became clear to him. He had made a mistake. He had trapped himself. All that was found out was that the First Order had to infiltrate the academy and gain trust. The most surprising thing was that the leader of this secret structure himself died in a terrorist attack. But the dead are not discussed. Now everything has fallen on the protagonist's shoulders. His own secrets became entangled with the dark history of Theon Academy and the underground organization consisting of 4 orders. The highest and most dangerous is Zero. It seemed like the only chance was to use Theon Academy itself to get rid of the orders once and for all. But while global plans are on hold, it's time to return to Roger Celici's everyday life. The first lecture in his life is already upon him. The subject is the theory of spells and elements. The most popular rumor about him is that he is a former aristocrat. But as soon as Roger entered the audience, the atmosphere changed dramatically. The first impression decided everything. He spoke confidently, clearly described the course, and immediately warned. Not only second-year students but also beginners can get here. But those who hoped for an easy passage were in vain. Getting a good grade in his course will be difficult, and that was said for a reason. The protagonist sincerely hoped that in this way he would scare away the majority. The main goal is to keep no one from coming. The students were silent. The semester had officially begun. And after the class, Roger began to wonder if he had gone too far and hurt someone's pride. But the sudden meeting immediately lifted my spirits. A new teacher approached him, the young and lively Selena. She was only interested in one thing. Had Roger eaten yet? Surprisingly, the protagonist found common ground with the other teachers quite quickly, with everyone except Barrymore, so he was clearly not liked. Roger also noticed that most of the professors were of humble origins, but this did not prevent them from being true aces in their fields. And by all accounts, there was definitely another first-order agent hiding among them. Despite the tension, our hero finally began to form useful connections. But while social games remained in the shadows, it was time to return to the most interesting part. Roger's first lecture. He sincerely hoped that the auditorium would be empty, but he miscalculated. The class was packed to the brim. His arrogant tone and strict demands only fueled the students' excitement and desire to prove the opposite. Now you can't give up. You have to give it your all. His course was divided into 4 areas: liberation, elemental magic, telekinesis, and fortification. One of the students recalled that they usually teach only 2 profiles, so Roger clearly pushed himself too high. But even her doubts were lost in the background of his voice, confident and captivating. The professor didn't just talk, he demonstrated, and he cast the spells at an accelerated pace. Science in this world was still developing, and few people could use such methods. It's no wonder that the students immediately bombarded him with questions. And Roger promised everyone they would all learn the most from what he knew about spells. But that's when she intervened, a student named Flora. She couldn't stand it and loudly declared that it was impossible to speed up the casting of the spell. Well, I wonder how our hero will get out of this now. The audience instantly fell silent. Everyone was waiting for an explosion. After all, it was Flora Loomis who once angered the previous teacher, and he left the academy. But Roger didn't get angry. On the contrary, he calmly asked for an explanation. Everything turned out to be simple. According to the girl, this technique was impossible even for geniuses. But the hero wasn't surprised. Geniuses simply didn't try. World magic has long been mired in tradition, while science has relentlessly rushed forward. And now, it seemed, the moment had come when magic was to make up for lost time. Roger immediately declared that magic has a future, and if no one has sought to take it to a new level, then he will be the first. The hero did not engage in idle talk. He immediately suggested that Flora show him how quickly she could cast spells, but she didn't give up and posted a solid result: 4 seconds. However, Roger only needed 0.2. His method was called the Origin Code, a technique for accelerating spells without changing their structure. Yes, the names really sound strange, but they are part of this mysterious system, and it is through them that you can truly immerse yourself in the world. All of Flora's doubts were instantly dispelled, but she interrupted the class without permission, acting abruptly, defiantly, and for that, Roger took away 10 points from her. However, after appreciating her perfect execution of the flickering flame technique, he returned the same 10 points back, because diligence is what he respected above all else. At the end of the class, Roger announced that he would select the best students and teach them the seed code technique. This completed the pair. As soon as Roger left the audience, the atmosphere changed. One of the aristocrats immediately began to mock. They said that this show could only impress fools, and the commoners had once again proven their limitations. Such words only strengthened the conviction that they had no place at Theon Academy. A verbal altercation broke out between the 2 students, but another boy immediately intervened. His sharp attack on the rich man's family was painful. It touched a nerve. However, he could not answer or even attack. The academy does not forgive such things, and other students were already watching the scene with interest. Aiden sincerely thanked Leo for his unexpected support, and it seems that new bright characters have appeared in the story. The guys quickly found a common language, and everything indicated that they would make a good team. Now, let's eavesdrop on what they're whispering about. Aiden was a simple guy. What was in his mind was on his tongue. So Leo decided to briefly explain how everything works here. First of all, Second-year Flora Loomis is a strange person, and it's best to stay away from her. It was rumored that she was the one who led the previous teacher to be fired. Secondly, the daughter of the Exilian family, the third princess, is studying in their group. And thirdly, Frieden Volberg was considered the main one among the second-year aristocrats, and that fool who just grabbed Aiden was one of his supporters. Leo promised to tell us about the rest on the way from the audience. Meanwhile, Roger remembered the lecture. The students' reaction was much better than he expected. Moreover, this world was at the level of the 19th century, so his ideas here did not just look revolutionary, they became incredibly valuable. However, to stay in the shadows, you will have to carefully prepare your materials and cover. The rector of the academy was already waiting in the professor's office. Eliza Willow immediately asked about his reaction to the office, but Roger did not understand what had brought her here. But in reality, everything was simple. The rector was watching over her team. But with every glance she gave, Roger felt a tingling sensation all over his body. Eliza calmly told how she had visited other teachers, but the fact that she had left him for last was alarming. This could only mean one thing: Madame Willow knew something. No matter how well the organization hides itself, the rector will definitely not miss any suspicious details. Despite this, she spoke enthusiastically about his innovation and asked him to be careful with the princess who attended his classes. The rector clearly had high hopes for Chelich. After saying goodbye, Eliza's assistant was already waiting in the hallway, and he had only one question: could Roger be trusted? As you could already see, all events were just beginning to gain momentum. Roger had not yet had time to fully immerse himself in the new reality, so it was worth carefully following his steps. The rector could not give a clear assessment. She usually focused on those who immediately aroused suspicion. But Professor Roger remained a mystery. Moreover, Eliza was genuinely surprised that Chelichi didn't even flinch in her presence. Withstanding her magical gaze twice is a feat beyond the power of even experienced sorcerers. This only confirmed that the professor was relying solely on willpower. After this, the rector became even more interested in him. She began to suspect that the incident on the train was not an accident, but a carefully planned operation, as if someone had deliberately created chaos to take the place of the real Roger. The assistant couldn't say anything specific, but he agreed with one thing: the professor was not an ordinary person. The conclusion was obvious. The new employee should be monitored further. Salici, although a little stunned, decided to concentrate on his work. Thanks to the rector, he learned that he had received quite promising students under his care. Among them is a first-year student who has been vouched for by the Magic Tower, one of the most influential bodies in the world of magic, as well as an imperial princess from House Exilian. In addition, among the students there was another boy who practiced a very rare type of magic. His face seemed familiar. The work promised to be not just interesting but exciting, especially considering the distrust on the part of the rector, which only fueled the intrigue. But at the same time, Salici understood that connections with the secret organization were a risky business. The Academy does not forgive such a thing, and it is not a fact that anyone will cover for him at a critical moment. However, all these thoughts were instantly dispelled. A tour of the Academy was on the agenda. The professor had no idea that at that very moment a scandal had broken out in the training hall. As always, the reason was status. An ordinary girl turned out to be unpopular with one of the aristocrats, but she believed that there should be no commoners around her. The poor student knew that no one would listen to her. Meanwhile, the aristocrat only heated up the situation, demanding apologies and behaving condescendingly. As a result, she simply used magic against the defenseless Renee. Fortunately, Salici intervened. The professor did not understand what kind of protection of honor was being discussed because all students at the academy were considered equal. He couldn't just turn a blind eye to what had happened. However, the aristocrat exploded with anger. She called him as worthless as all former nobles, and apparently these words hit the mark. The aura that erupted from Chelichi was powerful and menacing, as if death itself had met with primal fear. There was a warning sign hidden in this explosion of power. He calmly clarified what exactly the student had said. It was at this moment that Professor Selena rushed to them. She was seriously afraid that Roger would lose control and raise his hand against the student. But fortunately, she was wrong. The professor admitted that the girl was right, but reminded her that she was now a student and he was a mentor within the walls of Theon. Doubting his authority could have cost her much more. Despite everything, this time Roger decided to let the culprit go unpunished. Before leaving, he checked to see if Renee was okay. He left the girls in Selena's care and disappeared into the hallway. Renee couldn't believe that the professor remembered her name. His words about the equality of all students touched her deeply. The image of Roger, which until recently had seemed cold and distant, now looked completely different. For the first time, she felt trust. Now she was ready to follow him. Meanwhile, Kalichi himself was not feeling too well. Without the special pills, he would have already lost control of the side that was supposed to remain in the dark. The problem was that it was the last dose, so you'll have to activate special spells and get in touch with your friend. The very next day, the academy was shaken by news. At night, a strange figure resembling a werewolf was spotted in the city. The professor took this with humor, writing it all off as another legend about a local ghostly werewolf. But the professor's conversations quickly turned into an enthusiastic discussion of Roger's powerful spells. And while the magic tower didn't send any news, the rest of the teachers began to openly envy him. That same night, Roger took to the streets of the city, and it was in the darkness that the werewolf was already waiting for him. The professor met the attack calmly, as if he had expected exactly this. He dodged without much effort and made it clear that he had been waiting for this cunning scoundrel, who had disappeared somewhere, for a long time. The creature muttered something silently about how Roger hadn't even tried to pretend to be surprised in so long. And although Kalichi showed no emotion, he was glad to see his old friend Hans again. Roger wondered what his old friend had done this time, especially considering the form he had taken. Hans himself did not expect that a small dog in the arms of some lady would decide to bite him right in the middle of the street. Yes, that's right. Hans is not exactly human. His uniqueness lies in the fact that after being bitten by any animal, he instantly takes on its form. But fortunately, Roger had an antidote, and the situation was quickly resolved. After that, the professor immediately reminded me of his own changes, and Hans, intrigued, wanted to know how his friend created a new personality. He was truly impressed by this story, but one thing worried him. He had heard about the First Order. More recently, in the underworld, this organization persecuted a group of young men and called itself Black Dawn. The protagonist, of course, managed to survive, but he knew perfectly well. One carelessness, and he would be exposed. That's why Hans brought him a personal suitcase, with everything he needed to prepare. However, the professor could not understand why, if everything was so serious, Hans asked to wait 2 days. Why didn't they meet right away? Were the rumors about the werewolf true? But Hans was genuinely surprised. He had only arrived in Leatherwalk today. Both quickly realized that something was wrong, and in a moment they saw a real werewolf on the roof. Without hesitation, the boys hid behind the building. The creature had clearly gone hunting. Roger noticed a strange detail. The werewolf had a tag around its neck, and it looked as if someone had hung it on purpose. The professor decided to test this with a weapon. It was a surprise to Hans. The last time Roger had shot was when he was Abraham Van Helsing, and as soon as he took out his weapon, the werewolf immediately rushed towards him. The questions grew, but the answers could only be obtained by catching the monster. The attack was swift, but Roger responded with a spell that put the creature in a strange state. It was a powerful ultrasonic signal that nearly ripped the monster's head off. The silver bullet wasn't even needed this time. It was time to find out where this werewolf had come from. But just as Roger was ready to act, the screams of the police came from the street. The monster took the chance and jumped onto the roof, preparing to escape. But Roger decided one thing. This time, he wouldn't let him go. Of course, Roger only wanted to stop the beast. But there was no choice left. A fierce fight broke out. For the first time since that incident on the train, he unleashed his power again. The opponent reacted with lightning speed. He definitely couldn't be broken with one blow. Everything was used. Magic, fists, cold steel. The werewolf was agile, but the dagger proved decisive. Roger cut off his head. At that moment, Hans was passing by the building and almost fainted when the monster's head rolled out at his feet. But Roger didn't care anymore. He got everything he wanted. One thing was clear to him. The creature was the result of an artificial experiment, and that meant his plan had to be implemented immediately. The first step was to find a place to settle, and Leathervec was a perfect fit. Much better than the capital. Amidst this chaos, they will be able to remain in the shadows. Hans had to gather all the relevant information, and Roger had to wait for the right moment to make his move. If you can't act openly, you need to find allies. A werewolf in this era was something completely out of place. But the pendant around his neck confirmed that it was an experiment. Roger still hoped that he would never have to get involved in such matters again. But that was not to be. The next day, news spread through Leatherback. Civilians had been killed. Roger couldn't believe it. Had other monsters really appeared in the city? According to teachers, among the victims were even two first-year students from Theon. The rector personally called everyone together to report the tragedy. There was an uproar in the hall. Some claimed that the academy was under the protection of the Empire, and no monster could penetrate inside. But one of the teachers insisted someone from the common people was behind the attack, because the victims were nobles. These words hit home. Such accusations are not easily forgotten. Roger was closely monitoring the situation. Until recently, it had seemed to him that the Black Dawn was operating from a losing position, but he was wrong, inciting the people to revolt at the very time when they should have been united. Now the professor better understood how the most influential academy on the continent worked. Suddenly he noticed a tiny bug on him. It was a note for the First Order. 3 subjects escaped and needed to be caught urgently. These creatures posed a direct threat to the professor's exposure. Roger couldn't understand why he was constantly being given new challenges, but it was clear that it all led back to the Order. And judging by the reaction, even Black Dawn didn't expect such a turn of events. It was critically important for the protagonist to remain in the shadows. Any exposure meant the end. Meanwhile, the teachers have adopted new rules. Students are prohibited from leaving the dormitories at night, and penalty points will be awarded for violations. After that, Roger unexpectedly met with the informant. It was the same girl who recognized him as a member of the First Order during their first meeting. Now she was pretending to be a student. Something was clearly wrong here. Her name was gray-haired Roshan. To keep their conversation confidential, the professor created a protective field around them. He also insisted that she address him exclusively as professor. The conversation culminated in events in the city. The Shamsu School is a group of scientists expelled from the scientific community for forbidden experiments. Their targets remained unknown, but the subjects escaped through the sewers and were responsible for the latest killings. Sedina already knew that the professor had been asked to deal with this situation and offered to help. It turned out that the Second Order, Victor Dreadful, was also involved. The girl insisted that Roger eliminate the 3 objects as quickly as possible. But she was genuinely surprised when the professor took out the werewolf collar. Roger couldn't help but wonder how gray-haired was able to contact him so easily. The girl did not arouse suspicion and seemed to have extraordinary talent. At the same time, she was still in the Third Order. Maybe she just didn't have a choice. It is likely that Sedina came from a noble family, and the antisocial organization was unlikely to treat nobles kindly. Maybe she's just a puppet that will be thrown away after use. Roger had recently finally realized how precarious Theon's position was. But the balance of the Black Dawn has also already been disrupted. It was quite possible that gray-haired could still be of use to him. He praised her. The girl's progress was truly noticeable, and these words were extremely pleasant for her. But this meeting did not go unnoticed. Flora knew very well that the professor had used a spell, and this thought haunted her. Loomis analyzed everything and determined that it was a sound silencing spell. Such a magical trace was invisible to ordinary people. Another question is, why would the professor do this to a stranger? Meanwhile, teachers warned students not to go outside the dormitories at night, and rumors about werewolves spread with incredible speed. Aiden and Leo decided to stay away from all this, but their conversation was suddenly interrupted by a girl with bright red hair. It was Tracy, clearly up to something. It turned out she wanted revenge in the fight with Aiden, but the boy wasn't up for it. Then Tracy suggested another condition. Whoever catches the werewolf first wins. Leo agreed without hesitation. The guys quickly realized that this girl was fearless and could even organize a hunt on her own. It was clear. The next night would be very restless for them. At this time, Professor Roger was patrolling the academy grounds. During the night, he had already caught several students violating the new rules. The reason was obvious. A reward had been set for the werewolf, and therefore the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. So Roger reached the sewer. According to Selena, it was through her that the monsters escaped. This was confirmed. It was impossible not to notice the traces of werewolves. Soon the tracks split. One of the giant monsters headed towards the academy. Roger was not surprised by the screams that came from that direction. The hunt had already begun. His victims were the familiar Renee and the third princess. They were in mortal danger. But one spell from the professor threw the monster away. However, immediately after that, each of the girls received 5 penalty points. The princess rushed after Roger. She didn't understand why the professor didn't even ask if they were okay. However, his reaction was extremely negative. He did not want the princess to deny his request. The girl was almost offended because she only wanted to help Renee. But in her excitement, she forgot to think about her own safety and was now arguing with the professor. Roger was shocked when the girl began to ask not to punish Renee. She said that she had simply fallen asleep during her studies. He thanked her for her dedication, but reminded her that the situation was much more serious now. Eventually, the girls returned to the dormitory safe and sound, and Roger had to get down to business. The monster was already running away. However, the professor acted swiftly. The girls managed to see him use the levitation spell and watch the real battle in fascination. Salishi felt his strength gradually leaving him. He had already used up too much magic, and he definitely didn't want to demonstrate his full potential in front of the students. Roger was surprised that the monster knew how to use improvised objects in battle. This werewolf turned out to be surprisingly intelligent. It looks like it was based on a wolf, and now the protagonist began to doubt whether these were real werewolves at all. Meanwhile, Aiden and Leo set out to find Tracy. As soon as they heard her voice, they immediately rushed after her. It turned out that the girl had come across something interesting, a little werewolf. The kids, of course, wanted to catch him, but it was pointless to think that he was just sitting there. As soon as Aiden noticed the strange collar around his neck, the students were gripped by an unsettling foreboding. A real giant werewolf suddenly pounced on the students. The anxious anticipation turned out to be not in vain. Tracy knew she had to pull herself together. That was the only way she could win. Fortunately, Aiden managed to cover the hot-tempered girl from the blow. He realized that the creature was simply protecting its young. It seemed like the boy even started to talk to the werewolf. It suddenly calmed down and backed away. The reason for the aggression was fear for the baby. Aiden asked Leo and Tracy to confide in him. It seems he understood something important. The boy calmly turned to the werewolf, showed him the medicine, explaining that his cub was sick. The creature seemed to understand and reached out to him. But at the same moment, she was captured by incredible threads of light. When Roger arrived on the scene, he simply exploded with rage. What were these three even doing in the forest? However, he decided to sort things out later and ordered them to return to the dormitory immediately. Aiden tried to stop the professor by sharing his guesses. Roger didn't listen to all this nonsense, but something else struck him. A baby werewolf crawled out of the bushes. With one sharp movement, the professor pushed the boy away, and then destroyed the creature. The students were expected to be punished the next morning, and so it happened. They awaited the verdict in a separate office, where the rector personally visited. If Eliza herself had come, then something much more serious than just penalty points awaited them. Roger confirmed that if something went wrong, new casualties would be inevitable. However, the rector warned him not to scare the students too much. In the end, they received both penalty points and a reward for courage. The friends returned to their usual school routine. But Aiden couldn't get the story out of his head. Roger was also haunted by eerie images, a baby crawling out of the bushes. This was a person who had not completed the transformation, so the experiments were not conducted on wolves. However, Roger did not regret his choice. If he hadn't done this, he would definitely have gotten into trouble. In addition, this act was influenced by the fact that these werewolves had harmed many citizens. The protagonist simply had no choice. Roger, after these reflections, immediately contacted Hans regarding his request. Meanwhile, 3 of our students were resting after all this chaos. Tracy immediately noticed how excited Aiden looked, but the boy couldn't refuse the conversation. He immediately put everything on the shelves. At the moment of the battle, he noticed something strange about the little werewolf. There was a chain around his neck. That was one of the reasons why the boy tried to stop Professor Roger. Aiden suggested that these monsters could have been created synthetically. In addition, Leo had heard rumors of suspicious individuals hiding in Theon. That's why the werewolf with the chain seemed like a rather strange sight, and Aiden clearly remembered the professor's expression. It seemed as if Roger had noticed something and was trying to hide it from prying eyes. The children didn't think the professor was hiding anything, but they guessed that Roger knew much more than they did. Aiden understood that all this was just his speculation. However, the thought that Professor Roger might be connected to those rumors haunted him. Moreover, the rector herself said that Roger reported everything to her in every detail. So the professor wouldn't do that if he was involved in something? Tracy generally stated that Mr. Roger was simply hiding how much he cared about his students. Well, that's where the dispute between these 3 ended. And I can say with confidence that after this terrible night, their friendship will become even stronger. Meanwhile, our hero began to review all the important papers that Hans had sent him. These were lists of recently missing people from Leatherwell, and the informant found a whole bunch of suspicious characters who were constantly near the abandoned factory. Moreover, this was the only case of the disappearance of an entire family. Well, the inspection didn't take long. The protagonist got to the right place in just a few minutes, and everyone around was already dead. However, his actions were closely monitored, and the higher-ups already knew about the rat. The protagonist also reached these higher ranks quite quickly. Not a single bullet could reach our hero, because the magic he used was unique. It perfectly reflected attacks. However, the villains also had a powerful weapon against him, the full power of which they didn't even have time to use. After all, they were torn into small pieces. During such a tense battle, Roger noticed small beetles flying next to him. The protagonist couldn't believe his guesses. Were these the same insect brothers from another world? However, first, it was necessary to deal with the current situation. By killing all the insects, he really stopped the signal that was going to the higher ranks. A whole pack of bandits was preparing to give Roger a warm welcome. However, quite unexpectedly, all the lights went out. Just as suddenly, the head of one of the thieves disappeared into the darkness. The insect owner did not understand when the rat managed to get inside. The next creature didn't even have time to begin its task. The protagonist chopped it down. The situation has truly become critical for the residents of the abandoned factory. The young professor had no time to figure everything out when something terrible happened. The giant insect's limb almost pierced our hero's shoulder. What was strange was that it looked like a new hand from one of the corpses. It seems that the man who died first was like the brother of the insect lord. And they were definitely conducting experiments on him, because the corpse gradually turned into a giant monster, and it could even talk. The creature said that the stranger would definitely pay. A large-scale battle was unfolding right before our eyes. The size of the monster was impressive. Roger was shocked at how, with such a mass of snakes, he had so deftly avoided their attacks. Even a full-fledged magical blow had no effect on the monster. The protagonist even began to doubt a little whether he could win this fight. Meanwhile, the monster was carelessly talking about all sorts of disgusting things. To even slightly impress him, a spell of at least 4th level was required. The protagonist disappeared from the monster's field of vision. He urgently needed to think about his course of action. After all, 3rd level magic and a pistol had no effect on the enemy. The professor didn't think he would have to pull out one of his trump cards. An incredible stream of fire and heat burst from our hero's hands. Meanwhile, Hans was freezing outside. The guy was only thinking about his partner returning soon. Just imagine his surprise when an incredible explosion occurred. Hans immediately realized that Roger had used his true magical power. After all, the entire factory was engulfed in hellfire. Immediately afterwards, Hans asked his friend about the situation. The protagonist assured that he took care of everyone who was inside the factory, and he also obtained a drug that turns people into werewolves. This world was truly permeated with incredible cruelty. But there was no need to worry now. Roger had already found the culprits, and it seems that a bloody reckoning will happen very soon. That same evening, a rich man was raging in a grand house. He invested huge amounts of money in these experiments, but his subordinates were never able to properly control them. However, the man hoped to receive research results and move on to a new stage. His goal was to create a drug of eternal youth. He dreamed of gaining not only youth, but also strength and perfection. But unexpectedly, he heard his name called, Belferoth Rickson. Behind him stood a mysterious figure who instantly pounced on him. This stranger wanted to ask Rickson only one thing. One had only to imagine a 7-year-old child who, together with his parents, had to face a terrible reality. A child who looked into the eyes of her killer with a smile before her death. And in that smile, you could see boundless gratitude. And how, in Rickson's opinion, did the man feel who had no other choice but to burn his entire family to the ground? The rich man began to laugh. He realized that this stranger had destroyed the test subjects. The man wanted to talk about this misunderstanding and resolve the situation. He continued to carry the delusion that these people died for the advancement of science. These words were more than enough for the stranger, and that's why there wasn't a drop of anger left in him. Well, I think you already know that this stranger is our protagonist, and his revenge plan was simply brilliant, to use the poison against the owner of the experiments himself. During this time, Roger carefully reviewed their research records. It turned out that even a small dose of the drug could turn a person into a werewolf. But now he was curious about the consequences of taking a huge dose at once. Bilford Rickson immediately felt sick. His body began to mutate, and a real monster stood before Roger. The protagonist wanted this monster to feel everything that the people he made suffer went through. The servants came running quite quickly at the noise. However, they found only a giant monster in the room. The wizards and guards immediately rushed to find the owner and destroy the monster. Meanwhile, Roger gave Hans a special safe. It seems that this time his mission was more than successful. The good news was not long in coming. The next morning, the whole city was buzzing. Rickson had been eaten by a giant monster. This man was not the last person either in status or in money. So the investigation into his death should have been handled by real professionals. Representatives of the National Security Agency personally arrived at the scene of the events. All local detectives had been relieved of the case. Now it was up to the Night Serpents to unravel it. However, all this pathos and image existed only for the public. Behind closed doors, the proud trio relaxed and chatted quite informally. Their commander, Enya, was well aware of Rickson's connections to dark magic and monster hunting, so the corpse of the horrible giant creature didn't particularly surprise her. All that remained was to carefully examine the room. The detectives quickly found a niche in the wall. However, it was empty inside, and judging by its size, it was definitely a safe. And, knowing Belfort as a cunning businessman, there was no doubt that was where he hid his dirty money. The Night Serpent's commander was alarmed. The unexpected death of a millionaire, a monster, a missing safe. There were too many details to call it a coincidence. It was clear that someone had covered the tracks very skillfully, and the only person she knew who could pull off such a feat, Arsène Lupin. However, Enya immediately rejected this idea. It was necessary to focus on all the strange events that had recently occurred in Leatherwalk, so the detectives went to the factory that had just exploded. But at this time, things were not going well for our protagonist. The side effects weren't just eating him up from the inside, they were literally destroying his consciousness. The whole problem was his true magical power, which required a gigantic expenditure of energy. If it weren't for the magic pills that helped conserve the spell, he would have been much worse off. However, Roger Khaleesi's main thoughts revolved around only one thing, whether he had covered all the tracks. However, there was one person left to talk to. That was, as you remember, Aiden, the same boy who tried to block the professor's path to the werewolves, the one who managed to notice Roger's emotion at the moment of killing monsters. Of course, the protagonist hoped that everything would work out. After all, what he feared most was that he would have to kill his own student for the sake of an alibi. However, that was only a last resort, one he didn't even want to think about. Moreover, Aiden was not an ordinary student. He was under the personal supervision of the rector, and if anything happened to him, all suspicion would automatically fall on Roger. Meanwhile, the Night Serpents arrived on the scene. Unexpectedly, everything around was burned to the ground, and there was practically nothing to complain about. The commander suspected that the fire before Belfort's death had happened for a reason. The detective's theory seemed quite logical. The factory was only considered abandoned, but in fact some work was going on there. That's why the fire had happened. Perhaps dark magicians conducted experiments there, and when they were exposed, they destroyed the evidence. However, it could also have been a simple coincidence. It was worth checking out all the strange cases in Leatherwake. One more event remained in sight: the appearance of werewolves at Theon Academy. Detective Enya was immediately interested in this. You could see her surprise when she found out that one of the professors had single-handedly dealt with the monsters. However, no one was able to examine the corpses. They were all burned. The Night Serpent's commander was extremely worried. If only one person is behind all this, it could become a real threat to the Empire. Meanwhile, the entire academy was buzzing with rumors about Professor Roger. The students were so impressed by his heroic act that they couldn't keep quiet. Besides, his lecture was supposed to take place that very day. By the way, the relationship between Renee and the princess improved significantly after the incident with the monsters. Now these two beauties even sat together. The couple started off brightly, as always. Roger decided to attract the students' attention and tell them about elemental magic. This is the most common, but at the same time the most basic, basis of magic. This time, he showed how their power could be increased from 20 to 80%, which is considered almost impossible. The professor demonstrated to his students the 4 basic elements from which it all began. However, compared to the 10 modern elements currently used by humanity, these seemed too simple. But such a leap in development had its dark reason. Fire was turned into a weapon to burn people. Water was turned into a weapon to drown. Wind currents were turned into a weapon to inflict deep cuts. Electricity was turned into a weapon to inflict fatal shocks. It was war and murder that pushed magic to a new level. However, the purpose of elementary attributes depends on what a person uses them for. It is only worth fighting for a better world. This is the mindset with which you should study magic. The first task for the students was simple: to create an elementary sphere. Most of them were fully trained. However, Aiden's behavior seemed suspicious to the professor. Was the boy planning a rebellion against him? It turned out that no, Aiden just didn't practice elemental magic very much, and that made him feel extremely awkward. Roger now realized that this particular student of Theon's did not possess even basic knowledge, although he did possess a few natural attributes. The professor decided not to leave him to his fate. With the help of warm memories associated with fire, the boy managed to create a flame. But this fire did not burn. It only radiated soft heat. It was more than just an attribute. Aiden's true magical power, embodied in the form of flame. Roger immediately explained that this was exactly the method he was talking about. A true wizard must put something unique into each of his spells. After that, the rest of the students started to do much better. But Flora Loomis was dissatisfied. She was hoping to learn something new, but instead, she was disappointed. In addition, the girl was tormented by the question, where had the man who publicly embarrassed her on the first day gone? Now Flora wanted to draw attention to herself again, to see if anyone would shower her with compliments. She decided to take a risk, combine several types of magic and apply attributes. But the situation quickly got out of control. In a panic, the girl screamed for everyone to escape. However, the professor calmly, confidently asked her to concentrate. He was going to help. The flows of her spells began to stabilize. You couldn't get distracted. Stop in the middle of the process and all the magic would simply dissipate. But Flora was determined to see the matter through to the end. Well, you're probably curious to know why Flora was the way she was. The looks directed at her were always imbued with envy and jealousy. She ignored them, moving forward. But there was one thing she could not bear: the cold, indifferent gaze of his own father. He looked at her as if she didn't exist at all. And that day, when Professor Roger gave her penalty points, the girl felt a sense of defeat for the first time. It hit me so hard that childhood memories came flooding back to my mind. She didn't even see the professor's face at that moment. And yet she was sure that he was looking at her with the same cold gaze as her father had once. And the Lumos family motto was clear: never forget those who wronged them. Since then, Flora had constantly thought about taking revenge on the professor. But that was before. Now she has managed to carry out an extremely complex magical process. However, Roger did not remain silent. He sternly explained that her action was rash. The problem wasn't that she tried something new and didn't succeed. That's perfectly normal. And that she was putting other students at risk. And besides, she combined two opposing elements extremely carelessly. Flora irritably declared that her combination of fire and ice was perfect. It was easier for the professor to show this with an example. It turned out that the girl simply froze the flame. It turned out beautifully, but only a picture. In reality, the desired effect was quite different. Roger did not understand what Flora really wanted. Was she simply showing off? However, his voice softened when he spoke about the main thing. The professor did not reproach her for her lack of skill. On the contrary, he recognized that Flora had a unique talent that he had not yet seen among her peers. But, in his opinion, the girl was just playing to the audience. And for her own good, she should have chosen a completely different goal. These words struck Flora. For the first time, she saw in Roger's eyes not reproach or mockery, only genuine concern. The lecture was coming to an end. But the professor had one more important conversation to make. It seems that the Renee you already know had no attributes. The girl possessed none of the elements. That's why she was called to the teacher's office. Poor Renee was terribly nervous, afraid that she would be expelled from the academy. However, Roger simply handed her the book. You should have studied under her, but only on your own. The book was called Non-Elemental Magic, and the professor's words were extremely clear. A new path into the world of magic was opening up for Renee. Roger once knew a special person, and this book was the result of her research. But this person has long been gone from the living. Even for Professor Roger, it was a real shock to meet a student practicing non-elemental magic. Her thoughtful, deep gaze made an impression. The protagonist saw in these eyes a person who knows how to distinguish good from evil. Although Renee was only at the very beginning of her journey, the main thing was that a special book had found its new owner. It seems like it was fate. Meanwhile, the academy was filled with noise and commotion. And again, Aiden managed to get into trouble. The same Jeevan again picked on the calm guy. The wealthy nobleman began to shower insults on Aiden. However, his friends, who had long been disgusted by Jeevan's behavior, immediately stood up for him. The conflict erupted quickly. Without any hesitation, Jeevan challenged Aiden to a duel, and our brave boy proudly accepted the challenge. He immediately declared that if he won, he would make his opponent apologize to Leo and Tracy for his words. But suddenly, Professor Roger appeared behind the duelists. Kelechi immediately demanded an explanation. Of course, he didn't like that the freshman decided to have a magical duel. However, he quickly realized that Jeevan had purposefully provoked Aiden. Someone else unexpectedly intervened in the professor's conversation with the students. Professor Barrymore was only glad that the boys had decided to fight and forbade him from interfering in their decision. Moreover, the cunning fox immediately suggested that Mr. Chelich make a bet. Both teachers placed bets on their favorites in this match. The duel was scheduled for 4 days later. During this time, Aiden should have significantly improved his skills because, in Roger's opinion, Jeevan had a significant advantage. However, there is always room for unexpected variables, and Aiden already owned one of them. Despite everything, the guy insisted, he wanted to defeat his opponent solely thanks to his own skills. And that's exactly what he needed Professor Rogers' help for. Once upon a time, a teacher told Aiden that her teachings should not be carelessly displayed. Otherwise, trouble will not be long in coming. This didn't mean he couldn't use techniques, he just had to follow his heart. Of course, the protagonist was not thrilled with his student's request. After all, he had already made a bet, knowing about the boy's special abilities. But Roger believed he could teach the student how to gain an advantage in a magical duel. The training that Aiden agreed to was incredibly grueling. Every evening, the boy felt like a squeezed lemon. In the meantime, it's worth looking into the dark affairs of your opponents. Professor Barrymore wasn't about to leave things to chance. He intended to help Jeevan win. The professor ordered the student to show the insurmountable chasm between the commoners and the aristocrats. Barrymore had no doubt about his protege, but decided to play it safe. To do this, he prepared a magical enhancer, a potion that was to be drunk just before the battle. Well, whatever methods the parties used, it was all for the sake of victory. And you and I are just observers, so let's see what comes of it. The stands were buzzing with excitement and anticipation of the fight. After all, a magical duel is not a rare event. Even the rector, Eliza Willow, came to watch in person. This cunning lady knew everything that was happening in her academy. So let's move on to the duel participants themselves. Both boys, full of excitement, entered the arena. The rules were simple. Whoever loses the magical barrier of their protective gear first loses. As the fight began, the fighters moved at an even pace. Jeevan expected Aiden to easily handle the initial attacks, so he immediately calculated how to avoid the disadvantage. However, now he had a huge reserve of mana and felt like a winner. Aiden also began to understand, if this continued, defeat would be inevitable. It was time to apply the technique that Professor Roger had taught him. You should have seen Barrymore's face when he saw that masterful, slippery maneuver. This was one of the techniques of combat wizards. Jeevan couldn't counter anything. His blows didn't even touch Aiden's defense, and now he was on his knees. Aiden was officially the winner of the duel. The stands erupted in applause. Everyone was delighted with the guy's performance. But Jeevan was not going to accept defeat so easily. He couldn't believe how some commoner could defeat him. He shouted furiously that Aiden wouldn't have won without tricks, and without thinking twice, he shot his opponent in the back with a new spell. There was almost no time to react. Aiden could only lunge and swing his sword in a flash, the very move that could have saved his life. Professors Roger and Barrymore understood immediately. It was anti-magic. The rector felt it too. And from that moment on, the duel was officially over. Everything that happened was closely watched by Frieden Volberg. He was intrigued by Aiden, and the boy decided he should take a closer look. But as soon as his eyes met Professor Rogers, Frieden turned and immediately disappeared. Meanwhile, Professor Barrymore was simply beside himself with rage. Aiden didn't understand why he was so angry. After all, anti-magic is not that uncommon, and it did not affect the outcome of the battle in any way. The conversation between the two professors ended only with Chris Barrymore getting irritated, so I won't talk about it. Instead, I will share a much more interesting event. A secret meeting of the Order. The assistant appeared in person. She congratulated Roger on his victory, and he immediately shared the latest news. Principal Eliza Willow was still looking at Roger with suspicion. She knew the Order had infiltrated Theon. And that was why Roger had decided to stage a spectacular duel, to get her attention. But that wasn't enough. He needed her support to take more serious steps. His meetings with Sedina might seem suspicious until she becomes a model student. And now the girl will have to do her best to reduce the level of mistrust. Well, Grey Hair was only glad. This was her first personal mission from the First Order. Recent events have allowed the protagonist to convince everyone that he is acting in the interests of the rector. And they also made it clear to Black Dawn, it's better not to joke with him. He can act recklessly and dangerously. However, such a game could not last forever. Roger increasingly thought about creating his own organization. And it was at this moment, as usual, that Hans contacted him and interrupted his train of thought. His friend had learned something interesting and extremely useful. Roger immediately understood. It was time to use his trump card. And no, don't ask. Even I don't know what it's about. Well, let's see what our hero has prepared this time. The world of thieves was far from peaceful. Belfort, who had recently been murdered, was a key investor, and after his death, many subordinates were left with nothing. That is why representatives of the criminal world gathered in one of the pubs to decide how to proceed. Suddenly, a stranger entered the room. The atmosphere immediately became tense. The thieves didn't like that some leftist guy decided to eavesdrop on their conversations. However, the stranger was specifically looking for the leader of the bloody group. This man, who was actually the protagonist undercover, introduced himself as James Moriarty. The name instantly made an impression on everyone present. They had already heard of this cunning consultant who had run the criminal system in the Kingdom of Delika for decades. His identity had remained in the shadows for years, so the appearance of such a figure in Leatherwake aroused surprise and suspicion. The leader of the group, although he was happy to see the legend with his own eyes, still decided to check if it was really him. Moriarty appealed to all visitors not to shoot. He didn't want to disappoint the gentleman, but their weapons wouldn't help here. The silence of fire spell instantly stopped everyone in the hall. Suddenly, a werewolf bursts into the establishment. This is all part of Roger and Hans's brilliant plan. They have thought everything out in advance, down to the smallest detail. The Bloody Group was the largest criminal organization in these parts, and it was they who carried out the most heinous tasks. They also had a close relationship with Belfort Rickson. His death angered them to the core. So now they have gathered at the very moment when the situation could unite the most dangerous freaks. Let's go back to the bar. After such a spectacular show, the leader of the Bloody Group finally believed that he was facing the real Moriarty. He did not hesitate and immediately moved on to the main purpose of his visit. He said he wanted to establish a business in these lands. But at the same time, he looked down on people like them. In fact, this evening he was going to put an end to the existence of the Bloody Group. The battle began sooner than expected. The bar was enveloped in darkness, thick and frightening, and only in her heart shone a crooked smile, reflected in the sword of our hero. In reality, this spell was called Fool's Dream, a third-rank dark magic that used shadow and darkness to intimidate a weakened enemy. The effect itself, which was imposed on the victim, was called the magic of combination. The protagonist was simply creating something unreal. The opponents were really strong, but they didn't stand a chance against the pre-prepared tricks. James controlled the shadows with such skill that they literally tore apart enemies. The thieves no longer believed that they were dealing with the same Professor Moriarty, because according to legend, he never possessed any fighting skills. But the hero wasn't going to explain anything. He just continued to destroy everyone in cold blood. His tricks were so sophisticated that it seemed like it wasn't a fight at all, but a performance of genius. Only the leader of the Bloody Group remained alive. The protagonist put their conversation aside for a moment. After that, the friends, finally remaining in silence, calmly talked. The bar was empty and Hans had regained his human form. Roger planned to transfer power over the Bloody Group to other players once he had extracted all the necessary information from it. Moriarty was going to keep only a few truly useful people and say goodbye to the rest. On the second floor, they found a whole bunch of documents, all of which could be useful for doing business in Leatherbeck. The protagonist was ready for the next step, because he already had acquaintances on his side who would help implement the new idea. I hope you haven't forgotten what our heroes were talking about recently. Hans was clearly not thrilled, because all the people Roger mentioned were broken-down psychos, although it was not for him to judge. But even if he was against it, the plan would still go according to Roger's script. If the hero intended to subjugate Leatherbeck, it was logical to come up with a name for his organization. Roger knew that he would have 8 reliable allies behind him, and the organization itself would be called Unknown, because that was precisely what it was all about. So 2 friends stayed at the bar to celebrate the birth of something truly great. Our protagonist's life at the academy was no less exciting. Professor Selena was genuinely surprised why Roger still didn't have a personal assistant. The teacher simply couldn't believe that Mr. Chelici had been working all this time all alone. It turned out that assistants received not only financial support, but also personal assistance from the professor. Some of them even studied under the direct guidance of a teacher instead of the standard program. The protagonist himself was not averse to shedding a bunch of petty things. All that remained was to decide who to choose. But the choice was obvious. Sedina was ideally suited for this role. Firstly, now she could quite legally communicate with him and even pursue him without arousing suspicion. Second, she was already on the list of recommended candidates that other professors had compiled for Roger. And of course, the girl agreed without hesitation. Everything worked out perfectly because now the protagonist had a chance to learn more about the Black Dawn. Within an hour, Sedina had all the documents ready and officially became Professor Celichi's assistant. Meanwhile, the students gathered before class began. Many rumors were discussed, but the story about the Universal Stone, which supposedly grants any wish, caused the greatest excitement. It was rumored that it was hidden somewhere in Theon, and this was what the third princess and Renee were actively discussing. But Flora was more concerned that Roger had begun to choose his own assistants. Miss Loomis was convinced that she was the perfect fit for the position, talented, ambitious, and ready to take on any challenge. But all the conversations fell silent when Sedina suddenly, quite loudly, asked everyone to be quieter. And it was then that it became clear to everyone who the new assistant was. The class went by surprisingly quickly, and at the end, one charming lady, Julia Plumhart, asked a question that created tension. She wondered what criteria Roger used to choose his assistant, and it wasn't just curiosity. Julia was an extraordinary person, a winner of the entrance exams, supported by the Magic Tower itself. She wondered if the requirements included exceptional magical abilities or a big name. For the protagonist, this question was more than uncomfortable, so he answered simply. The only thing he paid attention to was the student's character. This concludes the lesson. Immediately after that, Flora approached the protagonist. Miss Loomis had not sought to become his assistant. She had come for a completely different purpose. The girl decided to thank the professor for saving her last time. The conversation gradually moved on to another topic. The student was curious about how many magical elements Mr. Celichi could control. The protagonist cautiously hinted that 5 was his maximum, although in reality he was capable of using all 10. And if this becomes known, it will only make things worse for him. This ended the conversation. Roger advised Flora to leave a questionnaire for the position of assistant because, in his opinion, she would definitely succeed. But for some reason these words only irritated Miss Loomis. But Roger himself went to the rector's office. Miss Eliza wondered if the professor had heard of the recent rumors that the World Stone was hidden somewhere in Theon. Although the protagonist did not believe in such an artifact, it really existed. It was a mysterious object with unique power that appeared a long time ago. It can be called an ancient relic of unknown origin, whose power is hundreds of times greater than the capabilities of artifacts created by great wizards. Theon had possessed this relic for quite some time, but all information about it remained a strict secret. And that is why, if these rumors turn out to be true, the rector instructed our hero to personally take on this matter. From the outside, it might seem that Eliza trusts Roger. But really, she just wanted to find out who was really behind this professor. After this conversation, our hero's head was filled with thoughts about the Black Dawn. Has the Order started operating again? However, there was another reason for his concern. The protagonist did not even expect to find one of the relics in this very place. All this time, Roger traveled the world and changed personalities for a reason. All this was in search of the lost parts of this power. Of course, this relic was different from the one he had been looking for from the very beginning, when he set out for the capital. I think you remember where it all started, and now a new important detail has appeared. Our hero has the idea to use the World Stone to find the exact relic he needs. At this point, Roger only had 3 pieces. From the information he has, there are 4 more shards scattered around the world. And if our hero can collect them all, then it seems that we will find out the answer to this question a little later. Our protagonist had no idea he was already in trouble. That same evening, the third princess had a private conversation with one very important person, the commander of the Night Foxes, Tarina. The case concerned the recent werewolf attack on Theon. The officer insisted on a personal meeting with the professor who destroyed the monsters. Of course, the princess explained that she was talking about a new teacher. The detectives now had enough information to begin a thorough investigation, and they definitely weren't going to rely on chance. Meanwhile, the protagonist himself was also concerned about the rumors spreading about Theon. Students were free to move around, as they had been during the werewolf attack. So there were a lot of problems that could arise. However, all worries faded into the background. His students were bored, and Roger decided to show them something unusual. In magic, everything works quite simply. The wizard is usually the core of the spell. This is logical, because magical power comes from the caster himself. But as soon as Roger waved his hand, the flame suddenly flared up in a completely different place. He called this the coordinate assignment formula. Even Flora was amazed. She didn't understand where he learned to do that. In reality, it was just a slight modification of the usual manifestation of magic. However, he had no intention of teaching it. Mr. Shilichi just wanted the children to realize true magic only develops when there is a solid foundation, so they should focus on their studies. It is the most important thing for their future. After this brief demonstration, something important happened. Eliza Velatsu reported, "The World Stone has been stolen." It seems that the enemies were aware of the additional storage and struck at the most unexpected moment. Now Roger only had until midnight. The situation looked extremely suspicious, and the hero was convinced that the First Order was not behind this. It was necessary to act quickly. Roger called his assistant into his office. "Sedina will have to tell everything, without embellishment." According to the investigation, it all started with the Third Order sending an official request for information. It was during this time that they came across data about the World Stone. It so happened that it was then that rumors about this relic began to spread among the students. The Third Order believed in the reliability of the information and learned about the place where the stone was kept. Later, this became known to the Second Order and they began to act independently. The Second Order was led by a magician named Demiles. However, it remained unclear why he did not inform the First Order about such a serious operation. Gray-haired suspected that Demiles had his reasons. Perhaps he wanted a place in the First Order. After all, Zero himself had said that the 7 places in the First Order could always change. Now all the details of the escape have been clarified. The moment had come when the protagonist had to act. The gray-haired woman could finally catch her breath a little. She had already provided the most accurate information. Roger didn't quite understand why the girl was embarrassed by a simple thank you. At first, it seemed to him that this was a manifestation of excessive devotion to the Order. But now it was becoming clear that she had personal reasons for trying her best. The protagonist activated one of the most powerful spells, Aether Nocturnus. It was an ancient summoning magic spell known as a magical passage. It required enormous magical power, but it completely concealed the presence of the caster. That's why no one could see or feel him. No one except Flora. She felt someone walk past her and immediately went to check what it was. She trusted her own feelings so much. Meanwhile, the protagonist was already heading towards the Dark Forest, a place about which there were terrible rumors, that people got lost there and went crazy. That's where the kidnappers from the Second Order ended up. They were stuck in the middle of the forest with a fake world stone. The protagonist emerged from the darkness towards them. They called him Sir John Doe, and they feared him to death. The First Order contacted Demiles and asked what he was doing here. The only thing the Second Order could come up with was to give the stone to the ruthless John Doe. He thanked me and said goodbye. But the professor soon realized something important. The stone did indeed contain a colossal amount of magical power, but nothing more. It was not a relic. And at that very moment, an incredible ray of light fell upon him from the sky. A moment later, Eliza Velatsu herself appeared next to the stone. The rector was pleased. She managed to return the fake stone, although she had to try very hard for such a bait. Besides, Madame was curious to know if Professor Roger himself had appeared in the forest. Meanwhile, the protagonist was hiding very nearby, just under a tree. Fortunately, no one noticed him. As the beam approached him, Aether Nocturnus once again saved Roger. But what impressed him most was the power of Eliza's own magic. Her magic reached the 6th rank. It becomes clear that the rector had her own plan from the very beginning. And for maximum efficiency, she hid the truth even from her allies. And then, as if by accident, Flora Lumos appears. The girl was right next to him, and Roger felt a chill. She immediately began asking what the spell was and why the professor was in this forest in the first place. Salishi quickly realized that the girl did not suspect anything. It looks like she just found a way around the security. And soon her friend appeared. The protagonist had to escort both students to the exit. On the way, Roger took his pills, and Flora noticed. As they were leaving, they were met by Eliza Velatsu herself. Madame was visibly alarmed. What were the 2 female students doing in the silent forest? The girls quickly recounted the entire chain of events, and Eliza decided not to escalate the situation. She simply let them go. In addition, she calmly announced that she had already taken care of everything personally. Roger, feigning surprise, asked if her spell had worked in the forest. The reaction and the conversation itself finally dispelled the rector's doubts. She really believed the professor and went away. She also admitted that the rumors about the stone were part of a plan to attract those who usually hide in the shadows. At the same time, the real-world stone had already been moved to a new secure location. Soon, the protagonist himself arrived there. He couldn't believe that everything had really worked out, and he didn't regret leaving a magical mark on the fake stone. It turned out to be very useful. However, even a real stone did not have the power to fulfill Roger's main wish, and yet he was able to point the way to other relics. This is what impressed the hero the most. One of them turned out to be much closer than he could have imagined. Immediately after everything that happened, the protagonist contacted Hans. The old friend immediately picked up the fatigue in Roger's voice. He didn't understand why he had to go to such lengths for just one relic. In fact, Hans had no idea that the second relic was located very close by, right in Leatherwalk. According to the image, the fragment was lying in the auction house. A grand event was to take place there very soon, and it is quite possible that they will decide to put this fragment up for sale. The friends agreed to discuss other details at a personal meeting. Meanwhile, Flora Lumos was waiting outside the door of the professor's office. The girl didn't dare to speak for a long time. She wanted to know both about the spell and about those mysterious pills. Roger did not prolong the pause. Since she was silent, he was already going to leave. But Miss Lumos couldn't stand it anymore. She shouted for him to wait, and then she demonstrated her own formula for assigning coordinates. She truly impressed the professor. Not many students could master such magic. Flora admitted that she should be awarded for such achievements, but she didn't care about ordinary points. She wanted something much more valuable. That's how she first found herself in the professor's office, and soon they headed to the research lab together. There, Roger was going to show her something truly unusual. A mysterious figure appeared next to him, and Flora felt as if her head was about to explode. She fainted, and only came to her senses half an hour later. The professor calmly explained that he had only shown her the Klein butyl, but he was alerted by the girl's eyes and fingers. Her pupils dilated and her fingertips trembled. Flora had a rare ability, an exceptional sense of magic. She didn't just see the formula, she felt it, and this magic was completely new to her. However, Roger himself was not interested in this. But he understood that other wizards might have a different opinion. So it was better for the girl not to shine with such an ability. After that, the long-awaited meeting with Hans took place. Both men looked elegant. They were heading to a very special place tonight. The hotel was too noisy and bright, so their path lay to the closed fourth floor, a place where ordinary people are not even allowed to look. And there, very specific guests were already waiting for them. Black Rose. Violetta was shocked by Moriarty's appearance. Did he really come back to right old wrongs? Whatever the protagonist's words, Madame didn't believe him. After all, Moriarty, without any hesitation, destroyed every group that appeared in the city. However, the other participants in the meeting were not going to listen to their personal clarification of their relationship. Kirukas was the first to intervene in the conversation. He was interested in the protagonist's real plans because James clearly didn't agree to come just for a reason. Moriarty admitted without further ado that he intended to develop his own power, and that he would do it through business. He wanted to involve his friends in the business. They would take on the work and earn crazy money. The proposal sounded risky and rather suspicious. Kirukas, Black Rose, and the old children looked warily. It seemed to them that there was a hidden meaning to it all. But Moriarty decided to reveal one important thing to them. It was now dangerous for him to act openly until he had his most loyal allies back. He wanted change for Leatherwake, a neighborhood drowning in poverty, factory smoke, and hopelessness. And just as his comrades maintained a clear sky above the heads of ordinary people, so he wanted to turn this gloomy alley into a place with a future. Having outlined his business idea in detail, Moriarty expected a quick response from everyone present. When the hero and Hans returned to the street, Violetta approached them. She wanted to talk to James in person. She knew that the clothing market was controlled by the nobility and large merchants. Did Moriarty really believe they had a chance? But the protagonist wasn't counting on the elite. He wanted to create light, comfortable, simple clothes that ordinary people would use every day. Of course, they would try to stop them. But James believed that Violetta could use her charm even in the world of fashion. Black Rose was shocked. How did he know about this? And she could no longer hide another of her secrets. She took off her mask. A terrible burn was visible on her beautiful face, a trace of a spell. It was left by a magician who once considered it his property. But Moriarty wouldn't let her hide her face and decided to give something back. Barely touching her eye with his fingers, he dispelled the traces of the burn. Violetta was amazed by the power of true magic, and without hesitation agreed to work as Moriarty ordered. But one moment changed everything. The protagonist managed to react and dodge, along with the girl, as they were being shot at. It was the remnants of the bloody group that had come for his head. There was nowhere to retreat, and there was only one thing left for them to do: to enter the battle, turning it into a passionate dance of death. The robbers realized with every minute of the battle that even with magic, they were no match for Moriarty and Violetta. However, Black Rose is almost exhausted, and after this battle she desperately needs to improve her skills. But the protagonist could not figure out the shooter. He was clearly using the scent of dispersion and skillfully hiding his murderous aura, which meant only one thing: a true professional was hiding among the attackers. The heroes had to act quickly. The suspicions were confirmed, and Violetta had her own guesses about the attackers. These could have been mercenaries from the southern desert, members of Kalasarpa's assassin group who would kill for money without hesitation. Moriarty immediately remembered the name, although almost nothing was known about them. But it is known for sure that they possessed throwing knives and a terrible poison that destroyed everything in its path. The only option for the heroes was to disappear as far from sight as possible. And although they managed to escape, within just a few seconds Violetta was standing all alone among the houses. She couldn't believe that Moriarty had run away and left her alone. The killers were also confused, but they were waiting for a possible trap. And for good reason. The protagonist was hiding very nearby, and as soon as one of the mercenaries approached Violetta, he immediately fell dead. Such was the effectiveness of our hero's spells. However, it was too early to rejoice. Another killer of Kalasarpa remained alive, and he appeared right above the heads of the heroes, preparing to deliver a fatal blow. But he also underestimated Moriarty. He managed to respond, noting that the enemy acted skillfully but lost his vigilance too soon. After that, the friends quickly dealt with the remaining remnants of the bloody group. Violetta didn't fully understand why these people attacked, but Moriarty had long known the truth. The attack was organized by forcing the perpetrators to act, and the customer was definitely not Rickson, because the protagonist killed him personally. This confession stunned the Black Rose. The hero's frankness forced her to act decisively. Madame Violetta agreed to work on the business that Moriarty proposed. Returning to the base, the protagonist found a rather funny scene. Sheridan, a dwarf girl and developer, was cheerfully mocking Chance. Roger was genuinely happy to see his old friend and immediately asked her to look at his trump card, which had broken after using the anchor during Violet's rescue. Fortunately, Sheridan had 10 minutes to fix everything. Hans, meanwhile, was nervous and didn't understand why this impudent girl was annoying him. The protagonist asked not to speak of Sheridan in that tone. After all, she was much older than both of them. Although when they first met in the Delica mines, she seemed like a teenager. She was a slave in those days, but that is a thing of the past. Now it was important to find out who was behind the attack on Moriarty, that is, Roger. That same night, he witnessed an incredible spectacle. A group of people moving quickly, almost silently, with perfect synchronicity. At first it seemed that they were ordinary knights, but later the protagonist recognized the Order of the Night Serpents, which was run by Tarina Lionhall, the same one who had been assigned to investigate Rickson's death, and whom Roger preferred not to meet. His gloomy thoughts were interrupted by Sheridan, who had just finished her work. She upgraded Roger's multi-tool by adding a knife and poisonous needles to it. In addition, the girl joked that for a professor, he has excellent taste and looks like a true gentleman in clothes. Before going for a walk, Roger asked her for one more favor. Meanwhile, the night snakes were examining the scene of the battle, where many of the bandits had died. Tarina paid particular attention to two separate bodies. A rare poison used by Kalasarpa's killers was found on them. The commander immediately guessed that the one who destroyed these mercenaries was a magician with good skills in wielding cold weapons. The snakes already had a few key clues, and chief among them was the mention of Professor Theon, burning a werewolf to ashes. Tarina knew where to turn for clues. Roger was soon informed that he was wanted. Miss Selena explained that they were knights from the State Security Service. Fortunately, the meeting took place not with Tarina, but with a young, pleasant officer, who wanted to know more about the werewolf incident. And now everything depended on how this conversation would go, because she was the one who decided whether Roger's secrets would remain secret. It was quite expected that after speaking with Roger, the officer immediately headed to Tarina. Commander Lionhall was only interested in one thing. Could this professor be the same one who had skills with edged weapons? The officer reported that after the handshake, even through the gloves, he was sure that he was dealing with an ordinary wizard who had never held a knife in his life. He definitely couldn't be wrong. This result clearly disappointed the leader of the Night Serpents. She had hoped that she had finally found a clue. Her orders were clear. Inia was to remain in Theon and report any suspicious activity. Eliza Willow unexpectedly intervened in the conversation. As it turned out, the rector was an old acquaintance of Tarina's. Eliza asked not to pressure their new teacher because he was really useful. However, the commander had no desire to continue the conversation and simply left. Roger had no idea what kind of relationship these two women had. But thanks to the rector, he managed to avoid meeting the crazy Tarina. Now for a bit about how Roger managed to avoid suspicion. Lloyd, the very officer you couldn't relax around, acted as if he were conducting an inspection. He immediately turned his attention to the shelves looking for dust, but everything was spotlessly clean. It seemed he suffered from germophobia, and when Lloyd extended his hand for a handshake without a glove, it was clear that he wanted to check something more. Even before that, Roger had asked Sheridan to make synthetic leather, which was what he used, so the officer's plan failed. As you can see, this was an attempted verification for which the protagonist had prepared in advance. Now it was time to relax a bit and focus on preparing for the test. A week later, Roger had an important conversation with Sedina. The girl reported that after the Night Serpent's visit, everyone behaved cautiously, as if they were walking on a razor's edge. But 2 days ago, 3 members of the Third Order were arrested by the police. And, according to rumors, 3 students from Roger's class, Aiden, Leo, and Tracy, were involved in the operation. It turned out that they were performing a special task in exchange for money to pay for their studies. The protagonist ordered to no longer associate with those who could be caught even by students. They don't need such allies. Meanwhile, the students' first testing began. Roger promised to teach the top 5 the basic code formula. Immediately after the tests were completed, Renee decided to give the book to the professor, but he asked her to keep it for herself. After all, she will still need it in the future. This book was not just a magical tome, it symbolized respect for its previous owner. The protagonist was sure that only in Renee's hands would she be able to reveal her true power. After that, Renee went for a walk in the academy's courtyard. The relaxed atmosphere, warm sun, and blooming nature, everything around her set the mood for relaxation. The girl was already thinking about lunch, but these thoughts disappeared as soon as a group of boys appeared in front of her. They started throwing around phrases about the pride of a noble commoner. Renee remained calm and simply asked to be let through. I asked one of them if he was sometimes angry about her recent rejection. The guy couldn't stand it and acted instantly. He grabbed her arm and pushed her to the ground. At this moment, someone completely unexpected intervened in the situation. Frieden Volberg himself. Renee was frightened, remembering the rumors about his hatred of the commoners. But Frieden just calmly asked what happened. It immediately became clear to him that the girl had been abused. As soon as the culprit began to make excuses, Volberg silently cast a spell that silenced the boy, and he threw it in his direction that the real trash is not the commoners but the nobles who disgrace their name with such actions. When they were alone, Renee thanked him sincerely for his help. However, the story did not end there. Since the girl's dinner was ruined, Frieden decided to help and took her to his secret place, allowing her to come there anytime, on the condition that she didn't tell anyone about him. There, a wonderful dinner prepared by Volberg himself was already waiting for her. Renee was genuinely surprised. Frieden turned out to be nothing like the rumors had painted him to be, and it became clear, not everything they say is worth believing. At this same time, Professor Roger had another important task. Miss Selena was very nervous about her first exam and asked Khaleesi to see how everything would go. Together, they went to the garden, where the students were to demonstrate their skills in communicating with spirits. Selena decided to set an example first, and as soon as she finished her demonstration, the students got down to business. After that, she invited Roger to join in. But he just joked, saying the spirits didn't like him very much. In fact, only low-ranking spirits were afraid of him, while medium-ranking spirits reacted calmly. When Selena calmed down a bit, Roger finally breathed a sigh of relief. If it weren't for his medicine, even mid-ranking spirits might feel the same way as the others, and then Selena would definitely suspect something. The thing is, the spirits themselves weren't afraid of Chilichi. They were scared of something else, something that was behind him. Suddenly, the professor felt a piercing gaze and powerful, high-level fire energy upon him. This could only mean one thing. Someone from the First Order was hiding in Theon and keeping a close eye on him. Roger retreated deep into the garden, to a deserted place, and it was there that he received the magic letter. Burning words flashed in the air. "Let's meet tonight at this same place." The meeting did take place. The protagonist immediately got down to business. He couldn't stand wasting time. However, there was no body in front of him, only a burning silhouette. The creature declared that it sought to sow chaos in Theon. Its role was destruction, but the wizards of the Academy constantly extinguished every fire it created. Despite expectations, the fiery creature did not play games. Along with its supporters, the Second Order also disappeared without a trace. The stranger stated that the First Order, unlike the others, always acts independently. And with her abilities to hide her identity and help in the shadows, that's no problem. She didn't demand free help. She offered a mutually beneficial contract. But Roger was only concerned about one thing: who exactly this contract was being concluded between. The answer was clear: between John Doe and Esmeralda. However, the professor refused. In his current situation, it was too risky. The rector still didn't trust him, and he couldn't afford to take any rash steps. But despite the refusal, Roger had already gotten everything he wanted. It was time to go. Esmeralda stopped him, saying she had just learned something interesting. She remembered the assistant of the great John Doe, and she could not help feeling that something was wrong here. Was he planning something behind his allies' backs? Roger calmly replied that for someone who had come to ask for help, she was jumping to conclusions, and even allowing herself to be suspicious. Just because he showed up in Theon and didn't make a fuss, she decided she could look down on him? The creature finally agreed that the professor was right, although it added that his behavior was indeed strange. But John Doe didn't feel the need to explain anything. Esmeralda tried to make a joke of it, but Roger warned her that next time such words might have a price. His loyalty to the Zero Order is beyond doubt. Thus ended their secret meeting. Roger was on the verge of death, but he received important information, and now he knew where to look for Esmeralda. In the meantime, let's talk about something more pleasant. Little Renee was in seventh heaven. She was having lunch with Freuden again. Ever since childhood, she had a strange sense. She could unerringly sense when someone had evil intentions towards her. The only people who treated her sincerely without ulterior motives were Elendelle and Freuden, and Professor Roger, although the latter seemed to feel more guilt than tenderness toward her, and it remained a mystery to her. Suddenly, the girl met a stranger. He surprisingly knew that she had just had lunch with Freuden. Henry introduced himself and asked us not to be afraid. The guy said he wanted to improve the relationship and offered her a part-time job. There was a hint of resentment in his words. It seemed he was shocked that his friend was spending so much time with a simple girl. But what interested him most was her answer about work. Afterwards, there was a party for Theon's professors. All the stars of the Academy gathered, and of course, Roger Salishi was among them. Well, the party turned out to be quite expected. All the professors were busy looking for profitable connections among investors and patrons of the Academy. And Roger, instead of social conversations, had another goal: to assess the situation, and only then set off in search of the mysterious Esmeralda. His appearance and cold gaze clearly hinted that he was in no mood for conversation, and no one was in a hurry to engage him. However, there were incidents. Roger immediately noticed how some arrogant gentleman had taken a liking to Miss Selena. Of course, he couldn't leave his girlfriend without support. His words were clear and cold, but it didn't occur to the smug nobleman that this lady already had an escort. The verbal exchange quickly escalated into a conflict, with derogatory remarks about Professor Kellichi's status. The rector took control of the situation. Mrs. Eliza immediately recognized the boy, the son of Chief Luke himself, and she had a strong argument up her sleeve. The father immediately apologized for his son's behavior, but simply covering up the scandal would be unfair to Roger. So the rector proposed a fair duel. The protagonist was a little worried. He wanted to close this story as soon as possible and get back to his business. However, it was not the master himself who came out to the duel, but his assistant, an experienced wizard. One blow was enough, and Roger was back on his horse. With a sigh of relief, he finally took a calm breath, and Selena, without wasting any time, headed to meet the professors of animism. It was a great opportunity to research them and, perhaps, stumble upon Esmeralda's trail. However, hopes were quickly dashed. None of the professors even paid attention to him. In conversation, Esmeralda showed herself to be an emotional and impulsive person, and these calm faces did not resemble her at all. Deciding to catch his breath, Roger headed for the drinks table, and there he ran into Renee. As it turned out, the girl was working as a waitress at this banquet, along with her classmates. Professor Selena stayed close by, and incidentally mentioned that she had noticed another interesting student at the party, Joanna Lavitt, an assistant to one of the professors who had considerable knowledge in the field of animism. Something clicked in Roger's head. He suddenly realized that he had completely forgotten about the students, Esmeralda was a high-ranking magician, but was probably hiding under someone else's name, and Joanna seemed to him too suspicious. No matter how suspicious Joanna Lavitt seemed, she was simply doing her job. It seems Roger was fixated on the wrong thing and lost sight of the really important details. While listening to the conversations of the wealthy guests, he accidentally heard that Violetta, also known as the Black Rose, had already actively taken to the stage. Her clothing business was starting to gain momentum and was attracting more and more attention. What now looked like a quiet activity could soon grow into a powerful wave capable of changing the course of events. Suddenly, Roger felt sick. The voices in my head began to scream with unbearable force. The excessive use of magic during the duel had taken its toll. He had exceeded his limit, and as soon as he reappeared in the hall, something terrible happened. Just in the middle of the feast, a fiery monster was raging. Roger immediately understood that it was Esmeralda's handiwork. The professors immediately intervened. They summoned the spirits of wind and water and tried to stop the creature. But this creature wasn't just fiery, it was like magma. And this already indicated that they were facing a 6th-rank spirit, one of the most dangerous. Another disturbing detail was the creature's form. It looked like a human, not an animal, as is usually the case with spirits. Moreover, she had no lower body at all, as if she had been conjured up by some medium. What alarmed Roger most was the silver tray in the center of the table. It was probably the source of the summons. All signs pointed to Joanna Lavitt. She was clearly Esmeralda. It was impossible to catch up with her now. She had disappeared. But Roger noticed something else. Renee was under the rubble. She tried to stand up, but her legs wouldn't obey her. Another second and the heat could have burned her. But the professor was in time. He rushed to her and pulled her out of the wreckage. Her injuries were minor, so Roger immediately treated them with medicine. But Renee couldn't shake the strange feeling. She asked if they had met him before. The question threw the professor off balance. He sharply replied that she was mistaken and ordered her to leave the dangerous place as soon as possible. And he himself went to the last move. Roger uttered a familiar spell, Eter Nocturus. This was the end of the fire monster's performance. However, before that, the professors of animism tried their best to protect themselves from the creature. The water spirits they summoned only caused minor damage to the monster. One of the teachers realized that the situation was becoming critical, and the rector had long since left the banquet. And just then, like a spark of hope, Roger Salisi appeared from the shadows. The protagonist immediately rushed to attack, and another professor noticed something strange. The spirit seemed to be trying to protect something or someone. It later became apparent. The creature had been summoned through a medium. Roger used a cunning trick to destroy her from the inside. The monster, addressing people, called them treacherous and promised to burn everything to the ground, to which Roger challenged him, saying, "Let him try if he can." The creature replied that it would definitely witness their death. But those were her last words. The spirit was destroyed. As it turned out, Roger was right. The creature was indeed connected to the medium. The elf professor did not notice this connection. He, relying only on his knowledge of animism, did not even consider other options. After all, spirits are usually manifestations of nature and are indifferent to people. But this time, things were different. And it was thanks to Roger's intervention that the damage was minimized. The elf particularly noted the magic that Chalici used at the end. The protagonist's reaction was sharp, but the professor asked him not to be nervous. He said he had seen a lot at his age, and while most wizards take a long time to learn, no one masters magic as instinctively as Roger. This only happens with an innate gift for spatial perception. Suddenly, the elf asked an unexpected question. How was Mr. Chalici feeling? He was referring to the symptoms that appear when you use magic in an exhausted state. For example, strange sounds. Perhaps he was worried for no reason, but sometimes people appear with thinking that is far ahead of the average. The world calls such people geniuses, although this is not entirely true. Geniuses are those who, in order to reveal their potential, break down internal barriers. And there are those for whom such barriers do not exist at all. Roger was surprised by this thought, although it seemed quite encouraging. The professor agreed. At first, it may seem like a blessing, but people don't realize that this barrier is also a wall that protects them. That's why he asked if Chalici had ever heard any strange sounds. The protagonist calmly replied that it had nothing to do with him, but he was genuinely interested in whether there was anything that could complement this theory. Unfortunately, that's all the elf was told in his youth. He was impressed by Roger Salici's personality, but glad his worst guesses didn't come true. After all, an ordinary person definitely wouldn't be able to stand it with a sober head. But Roger insisted. He wanted to know more about the possible symptoms. So the elf suggested if a person starts hearing voices, so the next stage is the emergence of special vision, supersensitive perception, and then contact with the gods themselves. Here is an interesting conversation that took place between two professors at Theon. It seems that very soon we will learn much more about the mysterious Roger Celici. And for now, time for a little walk with Violetta. What can I tell you? Black Rose and its team did an incredible job in a short time. The street was completely reconstructed, expanded, and all conditions were created for it to soon be filled with artisans. Other groups have also begun to implement the protagonist's proposals. Kirukus is working on a musical that should replace the circus, and the elders are preparing a special magazine, a collection of fairy tales and stories by unknown writers. In addition, a new atelier has recently opened. At first, it will sell affordable clothing, and later it will invest in creating elite brands. Violetta was beaming with joy as she talked about all these changes. She had always dreamed of something like this. The protagonist invited her to meet her future partners. The first was Alex, a member of the Unknowns group. A true seducer and charmer, especially when it comes to women, he immediately introduced himself as a nobleman from the southern kingdom of Fatima and was happy to collaborate with Violetta. Roger immediately warned, this guy was still a scoundrel and a criminal. But let's move on to the most interesting part. Finally, all the members of the protagonist group gathered together. The first to meet them were Hans and the elf Bellaluna Fatana, the madam responsible for the production of medicines and gunpowder. Next was Phantos, the usually silent giant. In his place, the little Arfa explained everything. Hans was not impressed by the boy and did not understand how he could have met Roger himself. And really, you'd be surprised, Roger was a father to him. Not biologically, but it was he who raised Arfa, passing on his principles. Harpa decided to introduce Phantos himself. He turned out to be a beast man. I think the name speaks for itself. He was often hired for hard physical labor, but even he was defeated by our hero and decided to serve him. In this team, Phantos will be the combat agent and second in power. And now, Violetta. The girl started to fidget, saying she just wanted to show Roger a new street. She wasn't sure if she should join in. But the protagonist was direct. He demanded a clear answer. And Black Rose made the right choice. She agreed. Now the Unknowns had a complete, perfect lineup. These people were the best possible. And very soon they were to raid the Kanst auction house. The protagonist had already prepared everything and knew exactly where their target was. After all the bright events, the usual academic routines came. But Roger did not lose his vigilance for a moment. He immediately became suspicious of Miss Selina's frequent meetings with Joanna Lovett. They were talking to some strange man. However, it later turned out that this was one of the victims during the feast. Esmeralda looked innocent and pretended to be awake. But Professor Selina was sincerely worried that she couldn't help in the battle. Roger reassured her. Because, unlike her, he himself did not know how to smile so sincerely or be kind to people. It was her calmness and attitude that helped support those present during the evacuation. Selina just tilted her head and whispered, wondering if she had the right to hear such words. The protagonist listened carefully to her experiences, and then both returned to their own affairs. Roger immediately tasked Sedina with finding out more about Joanna Lavett. Meanwhile, outside the auction house, Mr. Luke waited impatiently for his sworn competitors. And how surprised he was when they turned out to be Alex, who introduced himself as Lord Ara, and Phantos, his personal bodyguard. The cunning Alex pretended to be a businessman who had arrived for an important business meeting, although in reality he had a completely different purpose. He brought a suitcase with him, for which he urgently needed to find a safe place. Mr. Luke, not wanting to tarnish his reputation, offered to hide this special baggage in the basement. I won't go into all the details of the operation. I'm sure you're only interested in the most interesting things. So I'll be honest. Alex and Phantos reached the basement of the Kanst auction house without any difficulty, the exact place that was their goal. Thanks to this cunning foray, they were able to carefully study the interior and plan of the underground room. Everything was going smoothly and they were about to return. But suddenly Alex heard a voice that he couldn't confuse with anyone else's. It was Enya Joyner, his ex-girlfriend and a night serpent officer. Fortunately, everything went smoothly, and both managed to leave the building unnoticed. Now all that remained was to report everything down to the smallest detail. I'll try to be brief, but to the point. The auction house turned out to be exactly as it was on Roger's map. The storage area for valuables was divided into 3 separate rooms. The auction itself lasts 3 days, and each day, items from one of these rooms are put up for auction, starting with the first one. Their plan is scheduled to be implemented on the second day. But on the third day, security will be significantly strengthened. The protagonist hoped that no force majeure would arise. The information that had been gathered was not enough. All fears remained at the level of hypotheses, and the plan itself remained unchanged. Meanwhile, something interesting happened. A rather mysterious lady arrived in Leatherbeck. Her assistant Betty was not happy. The hostess had too much luggage, but the lady insisted that we had to hurry. It was about to start raining. And she was not mistaken. When she counted to 5, the sky really opened. However, the travelers remained dry. The lady hid with Betty under the magic dome. In fact, this woman is Casey Selmoy, a famous detective with the title Greenwater of Celadon. She didn't arrive just like that. Something very strange has been happening in the city lately. The activity of suspicious operations has increased. Werewolves have appeared, but as it turned out, not ordinary ones. Besides, the last traces of James Moriarty lingered in Leatherwake. Casey was sure he was not dead. Her intuition and the evidence she had gathered said otherwise. 5 years ago, a tragedy occurred in the kingdom of Datura. Werewolves attacked the dead inhabitants during the so-called Bloody Night. Then a terrible monster appeared, the Beast of Gavauden. Abraham Van Helsing hunted it, but it later disappeared and was never seen again. Later, a mysterious thief with a black shadow appeared in the devastated country. Arsène Lupin. He operated for a year, stole many treasures, and also disappeared. 3 years ago, someone tried to start a war in the kingdom of Delica. And again, they disappeared without a trace. And recently, in civil war-torn Utah, Machiavelli won and disappeared after the fighting ended. Casey suspected that all these figures were the same person. And now, this mysterious figure was heading towards Leatherwalk. In addition, the detective planned to stop at the Kanst auction house. At the same time, our protagonist group was starting an operation. The first step is to get the elevator key. The operation began without complications. Violetta reached the guard's room and seduced him without much effort. As soon as the man wanted to play the game, the Black Rose instantly knocked him out with one precise blow. In the same room, she found the key she needed. Meanwhile, the auction was beginning in the main hall. Hundreds of guests gathered for the sake of undiscovered treasures. Among those present was the third princess, and now a student of Theon, who watched with curiosity. But her enthusiasm was quickly dispelled by Casey. The detective noticed that the Mermaid's Tear, the main lot of the exhibition, was a fake. She also understood perfectly well that the princess was already fed up with this event. Elendelle did not know Casey and had never met her before, so the detective decided to impress the girl. Using deduction and logical chain, she easily recognized the princess. As soon as Casey revealed her identity, Elendelle understood everything. A pleasant conversation took place between them. But we'll see very soon whether this detective flair will prevent Roger from carrying out his plan. And now, to the team itself. Roger found himself in an awkward situation. Director Luke recognized him and, wanting to show his respect, assigned him a guard. And this meant that the key participant in the operation was actually paralyzed. The protagonist called for reinforcements, Hans. He was the one who was supposed to help, but he also had problems with the movement device. Together with Kafka, they tried to figure out what went wrong. Due to a small noise, one of the guards drew attention to the strangers in the alley. Kafka came out first to intercept him. The surprise caused by the child's presence momentarily confused the officer, and that second was enough for him to lose consciousness. The guys dragged the guard to the trash cans, but within a moment his partner began calling for his comrade. That's when Kafka's rare talent for perfect voice imitation came in handy. Thanks to this, they were able to avoid publicity and return to setting up the device. At the same time, Alex and Violetta passed each other in the hallway. The guy pretended they were strangers and politely asked if she was okay. Black Rose thanked her for the rescue. The operation was finally moving forward. Alex headed for the elevator. Sheridan was to be the next to be nominated. After that, the second part of the operation immediately started. Sheridan released tear gas, and panic broke out in the corridors. Everyone rushed to flee. But Alex and Fatos had to take care of the guards. They pretended to be lost. Alex assumed his usual role as an Oriental merchant and began asking where Evan Luke could be found. As soon as the guards thought for a moment, Fatos acted with lightning speed. His blows left dents even on armor. The next step was the release of Hans and Kafka. and the protagonist at this time was closely monitoring the progress of the auction. Although he was still accompanied by security, judging by the signals on the walkie-talkie, everything was going according to plan. Then suddenly he noticed something that threw him off track. In the hall sat Casey Selmoy. Horrifying memories immediately flooded Roger's mind. The same waterfall where she had almost died to defeat Moriarty. She was ready to sacrifice herself, and he remembered it all too well. What is she doing here? Casey is not just a master of her craft. She has earned the title of Greenwater of Celadon. If she suspects anything, the whole operation could fail. But right now the detective seemed too calm, so she didn't suspect anything yet. Roger could only hope that his team would complete the task quietly and without unnecessary fuss. Meanwhile, an active phase of artifact theft began. The cameras showed a thief drilling a hole in the wall. Director Luke immediately sprang into action. The guards were already preparing to descend into the vault. The director was in a panic. These treasures were too valuable. The task for the knights was clear. Move the items to vault number 3. The assault team was supposed to capture the attackers in room 2. But no one was found there, even though the cameras showed otherwise. In an instant, the image on the monitors changed dramatically. Luke and his assistant realized that the picture from the cameras had been altered. Panic began in the radio. It was a trap. The robbers had originally targeted the 3rd vault, and the elevator leading to the surface had completely collapsed. The guards were trapped below and couldn't get out anytime soon. Luke was so shocked he didn't know what to do. In addition, the observation room turned out to be closed. Another surprise from Sheridan. The girl was delighted with the genius of her leader, and it seems that the mission was successful. Fortunately, all the artifacts were successfully loaded into the car, and the group of unknowns was able to set off. However, Hans had to stay behind to fulfill another personal assignment from the leader. He watched his comrades with admiration. They all fought skillfully, but it seemed that this was far from the only thing they were masters at. Hans told Roger the current situation. The device's battery was almost dead, so he would wait for him in the central hall. The protagonist immediately noticed that the guards began to disappear rapidly. They had obviously already been informed of the crisis. This meant that Professor Xalitzi could finally disappear from sight and join Hans. Meanwhile, Hans wandered through the empty halls of the auction house. Thanks to the sleeping powder, there was not a soul left inside. But suddenly the boy felt a disturbing change. Something was wrong, and at that moment, strangers attacked him. The protagonist was stunned by a loud and powerful explosion. Armed militants burst into the theater, ordering everyone to lie on the ground. Real chaos began. The attackers shot indiscriminately, leaving no chance for those who stood in their way. Roger was shocked how these terrorists had gotten into the hall at all. Had the unknown's plan distracted the security guards enough to open the door for another attack? He didn't even have time to think about the situation when a young man with dynamite on his chest rushed at him. Roger reacted instantly. He remembered that the Liberation Army used such methods. He managed to avoid the explosion, but he could have died. And that's not all. The attackers used black magic against the guards, causing even greater panic among the guests. At this very time, Princess Elendelle, barely alive, was trying to get out of the hall where real hell was happening. The Liberation Army fighters had already targeted her. The poor girl had already regretted leaving the palace at all. But she was lucky. Casey Selmoy showed up just in time. Her water magic was impressive in its scale and precision. The element covered the entire hall, and she wasn't alone. She was helped by the Night Serpent Knight, Enya. The building began to collapse, so the only option left was to flee. Let me tell you about one important conversation the protagonist has with his faithful companion. Hans sincerely didn't understand why the leader had even accepted him into the team. He considered himself a coward because he always left the most dangerous moments to Roger. But that was exactly why Roger chose him. Because a coward is someone who is afraid to hurt. And the protagonist knew how powerful and dangerous Hans's power was. Wasn't he afraid he might hurt someone? Hans decided to share another story. If you didn't know, he's an orphan who grew up in an orphanage. The only person close to him was a girl. Bright, sweet, full of life. One day she found an abandoned puppy and brought it into the room. But the dog bit Hans. Roger stopped him. He didn't want to listen anymore. It was clear that this was the story of Hans's first transformation and his first murder. The protagonist simply said an important thing. If Hans finds himself in mortal danger and runs away, he will not condemn him. But if he decides to fight back, he must use the item that Roger left him. The choice will always be his. And Roger will respect that choice. And so it happened. Hans himself did not understand what exactly had happened. One of the robbers tried to snatch the bag containing the relic from him. Hans grabbed him by the leg and, while receiving terrible blows, did not say a word. He was left to die. But there was only one thing in his head. If there had been someone else in his place, he would not have allowed the relic to be taken away so easily. He was afraid of losing the team's trust and accused himself of weakness. At that moment, the dagger that the leader had given him fell out of his pocket. Hans decided that if this was really the end, he would give everything he had. His body began to change. Despair turned into a maddening force, and Roger felt that primal roar instantly. In the car, Fados suddenly became wary. He sensed the presence of a real predator. His reaction was too violent for a normally cool-blooded fighter. So something incredible was happening in the auction building. Alex also stopped and remembered the conversation with the leader. Then Roger said who was the strongest on their team. It was Hans. And now it was he, this unknown creature who was bursting out, destroying the auction house. His strength was unusual, wild, and not at all human. People instantly recognized this monster. It was the same monster that had terrorized the Datura kingdom 5 years earlier, the Beast of Gavaden. Hans, who had completely lost control and turned into a creature, was no longer conscious. He pounced on everyone indiscriminately, like a wild predator. But it wasn't that simple. The patrol desperately tried to contain him, protecting the civilians, but their attacks had no effect. His body regenerated before his eyes, and the speed with which he moved, despite his size, seemed unreal. Meanwhile, Casey covered Princess Elendelle and Knight Enya of the Order of the Night Serpents. They were sure that this monster was long dead. After all, Casey herself had once seen his stuffed animal in the Datura Museum. But although the monster resembled the Beast of Gavaden, there were still differences between them. And that was the most disturbing thing. The monster that Abraham Van Helsing had once destroyed had reappeared, this time in Leatherwell. And it was here that the last traces of James Moriarty were recently recorded. The detective did not believe in coincidence. It all came down to one thing: Moriarty, the Beast of Gévaudan, Lupin. They could all be the same person. And that person was undoubtedly somewhere nearby. But there was no time to think. Her first priority was to stop the beast. But the magic didn't work. The mana dissipated, as if someone had intentionally blocked her powers. If she stops now, if she allows fear to break her, then she is not worthy of the title of Green Water of Celadon. At this moment, Roger arrived at the scene. He saw Hans and was surprised for a moment. He really had used the same thing. The protagonist had no right to leave his comrade alone with this horror, but now he needed time to prepare. Meanwhile, the creature went wildly mad. And at that very moment, as if in distress, a veritable horde of rats rushed to her aid. It was strange that this creature ruled over the animals. Even stranger that it was the rats who obeyed him. It was these creatures that Casey feared the most. The severed heads that turned into werewolves made the officers understand the true horror. The reason for the sudden appearance of monsters on that same bloody night was the Beast of Gévaudan. If they are not stopped now, history may repeat itself with renewed vigor. The detective's assistant insisted on escaping. But Casey couldn't leave this place until the last citizen was safe. And suddenly the monster froze. The werewolves also stopped moving, and all eyes turned to the roof of one of the buildings. There he appeared, James Moriarty. Casey recognized the figure immediately. The aura that literally compressed the air around him left no doubt that this man was the most dangerous being in the city. The monsters understood this too, and obeyed. Meanwhile, Roger hoped that Hans would recognize him after all. The leader felt that his comrade was alive, and saving your loved ones is not only a duty but also a personal choice. Casey was even more shocked. Moriarty disappeared and appeared in another place almost instantly. Teleportation? Quite possible. She shouted that you can't chop off heads. It only multiplies werewolves. But the heads didn't reappear. They just disappeared. This could only be the result of extraordinary magic or a sword made from a unique material. The fight was a real spectacle. People, without expecting it, began to trust Moriarty. His only goal was to destroy the beast. And as painful as it was to admit, he really knew what he was doing. Unexpectedly, Roger activated some substance. Gas began to spread around him. It seems that he had a cunning plan against the monster. Of course, this version of the Beast of Gévaudan was much smarter than the original, but even it understood. Its strength was running out. Roger's blows were precise and merciless. It was dangerous to distract the beast. But even so, he managed to summon a new wave of werewolves. However, Roger was already prepared for this. The area was teeming with monsters, werewolves, and rats. There were an incredible number of them, but for Roger, this was no longer an obstacle. It seems the finale has come for the Beast of Gévaudan. The protagonist stopped in front of him, coldly considering his final move. Now this monster has no defense left, no chance. The impact of his power ripped through the beast's body, leaving deep wounds that even regeneration could not heal. The creature roared, refusing to give up, as if it wanted to die standing. But Roger knew enough was enough. He ordered Hans, in the monster's body, to stop the noise, to get out of this form before it was too late. This was not his body, not his essence. The final, control shot sent the monster falling. Its body hit the ground, kicking up a cloud of dust. And at that very moment, a metal object flew into his back. An antidote. A rapid transformation began. Muscles contracted, fur disappeared, bones broke, returning to human form. Roger's assistants arrived just in time. Everything was under control. They instantly grabbed the unconscious Hans, whose body was still shaking from the exertion, and began to retreat. The knights, the guests, all the survivors could not believe it. The monster had disappeared. He was no longer there. But his comrades were worried. Hans had been hit in the body with a harpoon. No one was sure whether he would survive such an injury. But Roger remained calm. His ability to regenerate after transformation was simply phenomenal. Once the relic was rescued, the main task was accomplished. All that remained was to disappear until new units arrived. And then she appeared. Casey. The detective didn't just recognize Roger. She understood who he was. There was no fear in her eyes, but behind the calm mask was a storm. All this time she had been looking for him, and she was sure that he had not died then, at the waterfall. Her heart told her that this meeting was inevitable. Her words were like a challenge, as if she had never valued her life, which he had barely managed to preserve. She wasn't going to give up. And Roger began to understand. He had underestimated her. She knew everything about Van Helsing, Arsène Lupin, and Machiavelli. All these personalities, all the shadows of the past were just faces of the same man. She wanted to know what name he was hiding under now. But when she got to the truth, it was useless to run away. Now she wouldn't stop. Roger could see that this girl was ready to go to the very ends of the world. And no matter how he changes names, she will find him. It seems like murder will be the only way out. There was something in her words that made him freeze. She knew that James Moriarty belonged to the Black Dawn. The protagonist didn't understand how she knew. Perhaps she knew more than she was letting on. He realized. Even this truth was not hidden from his old enemy. And although he was not going to give up, even if it meant more civilian casualties, deep down Roger admitted that she was too lively, too stubborn. His thoughts changed. Casey wouldn't disappear, but she could be used. And that's how a new plan was born. She looked like the perfect hunter who wouldn't stop until she found her prey. So why not make her a weapon? Let her hunt not him, but his real enemies. She wouldn't destroy him, but she could destroy the Black Dawn for him. He wasn't going to stay. He had already decided. They were fleeing, and no force can stop it. Not even Casey with her magic. Not even all the knights of the Order of the Night Serpent. Her attacks were lightning fast, decisive. But they were blocked by his comrades. They fought in unison, as one. In their every move is experience, rage, and loyalty. Casey screamed, trying to stop their retreat. I swore it wasn't the end. She will find them. She will destroy everything they have built. And Roger heard these words. He didn't turn around, but he remembered them. He will wait for the next meeting. There's no point in delving into Casey's memories of Moriarty now. They'll come back to them when the time is right. After all the fuss, the detective was satisfied with how the knights had acted, although the real work was just beginning. She had gathered all the facts and evidence, and now had a key task: to investigate the mysterious gunpowder, which was unaffected by one of the most powerful fire-silencing spells. Everything pointed to one thing. The Liberation Army was incapable of such technology. But the Black Dawn, with which Moriarty was associated, was completely capable. The incident with the monster was no accident. The Dawn's supporters appeared immediately after its disappearance, so it could have been a test. Casey was not in a hurry to draw conclusions. She began a chemical analysis of the gunpowder because she understood that serious preparation was needed to catch the real culprits. Meanwhile, Hans finally came to his senses. Fortunately, he was in more or less normal condition. Roger immediately asked to give him what he had found, and then Hans noticed that the dark stone was still in his right hand. He had been clutching it even before he had returned to human form. And no matter what Roger did, the boy wouldn't give up the find. The stone was with him, as if it were part of something deeper. In any case, the work was brilliant. The protagonist only asked his friend to get dressed and come downstairs. It was time to share important information. Despite all the difficulties, the operation was successful. The team was not exposed, but the stolen valuables still had to be dealt with, because they were still stolen items. However, after what they experienced, everyone understood. Each of them had unique skills, and as a team, they complemented each other perfectly. Discussion of the combat part of the operation slowly gave way to talk about the amazing Casey Selmo. Roger explained that she was not just a sorceress, but a hereditary sorceress from a famous family, and also the owner of a colored title, a status that was considered extremely honorable in the kingdoms. They met for the first time in Delica, during the same hunt for Moriarty. Meanwhile, at the other end of Leathervec, Princess Elendelle was calling for help in a panic. She had found Betty, the detective's assistant, dead. A knight of the Order of the Night Serpents instantly rushed to check on her condition. However, Casey didn't seem worried. On the contrary, her appearance was surprisingly calm. She came closer, took off the sweater from the dead Betty, and showed a small hole in the back. The key that appeared in Casey's hand revealed a secret. Before them was a robot on autonomous control. The human appearance, emotions, facial expressions, everything seemed real. Even an experienced knight admitted that she had never heard of such creatures. This mechanism was a secret experiment of the Delica Kingdom, created many years ago. Betty is not just an assistant, but a combat soldier, designed during the investigation, when Casey did not yet know who Moriarty really was. At the time, he was just a brilliant mathematician. But when the truth came out, the hunt began. But that wasn't the only secret that was revealed. The protagonist admitted that Arfa, another member of their team, is also an automaton. Like Betty, he was part of the same series. Violetta became curious. Why does the kingdom need such creatures? The answer was simple and at the same time terrifying. War. Steel soldiers who can be led, who have no fear, ask no questions, and are impervious to pain. Mass production of such automatons was launched precisely for this purpose. But it's time to return to academic routines. Roger was worried after the incident with the beast of Gévaudan, because his false identities had been exposed. But now something more important is more important. The Holy Knights of Bretis have become more active. The Holy People of Bretis are an isolated island far from the continent. It is here that the legendary Order of Lumensis is based, with a history spanning centuries. They worship one god, stubbornly rejecting any other belief. For hundreds of years, these religious fanatics hunted down pagans, performed ritual purifications, and justified it all with a noble mission, the salvation of humanity. However, the influence of the order is no longer what it once was. Corruption, internal scandals, and constant changes in dogma have taken their toll. However, this worried the protagonist the least. Assistant Grey-haired reported a mysterious student, Joanna Lovett. She was believed to be a representative of the Second Order, and she really was hiding something. Her last name turned out to be fake, and her true identity was veiled. The girl came from the kingdom of Datura and survived the terrible fires of Loton, which occurred over 10 years ago. Only 3 people survived the chaos. One of them was the eccentric servant of Art Pierrot. Another remained completely unknown. And although the causes of the disaster were never established, its shadow still hung over the entire kingdom. Satisfied with Sedina's work, Roger went to the students. It was time to announce the top 5 students of the first exam. First place, to everyone's delight, was shared between Flora Loomis and Julia Plumhart. Both showed a perfect result. There was no second place at all. It remained empty, as if acknowledging that no one else had come close to perfection. Third place went to Tracy Prayad, followed by the petite but capable Renee, and last on the list was Leo. All 5 were supposed to get their items after class, but first it was time to move on to a new topic. After all the fighting, explosions, and transformations, a little magic lecture seemed like a breath of fresh air. The professor decided it was time to focus on magic circles. They were a more stable form of spell than the usual formulas, although they required more attention to detail. But instead of classic circular schemes, Roger presented an unconventional approach. A square magic circle appeared on the board, a shape that most students found ineffective. However, the spell worked. Even though the corners could have broken the flow of mana, this time everything looked perfect. The reason turned out to be the symbols inside the circle. They stabilized the flow of energy and prevented mana leakage. Flora was the first to voice her guess, and the professor confirmed it. The correct use of symbols opens up incredible possibilities. If students master this principle, they will be able to create their own formations. And this will be the next exam task. Roger was eagerly awaiting their ideas. After the lesson, the 5 chosen ones finally received their basic code elements. It was considered the foundation for further development. But there was one condition. In order to continue their studies at a deeper level, they would need to maintain their position in the top 5 until the very end of the semester. No exceptions. Renee felt a slight disappointment. It had all been too easy. She didn't even manage to ask the professor everything that had been bothering her for a long time. She was distracted after class when Princess Elendelle suddenly invited her to dinner. But Renee already had arrangements with someone else. And although the girl expected insult or disappointment, the princess's reaction was surprisingly warm. She simply wished her a good day. But in reality, everything turned out to be much more complicated. Elendelle followed her silently, watching from the shadows of the trees and wondering who could have so captivated her naive, innocent Renee. Something was boiling inside the princess, but her thoughts were interrupted by a voice behind her. Frighten appeared and asked in surprise what she was doing. What he saw made Elendelle confused. The flowers in the field, the strange atmosphere. Was he really the one who was going to have lunch with Renee? It all looked as if Frighten had prepared the entire scene for the meeting, but his reaction was cold. He calmly pointed out that he shouldn't be criticized for his hobby. Tensions were rising. The princess was already upset about Renee, and now she had unwittingly revealed one of her own secrets, and this made Frighten very angry. He reproached Elendelle for being obsessive, hinting that it was because of this behavior that she had no friends. Renee felt confused and anxiously asked if everything she had said was true, and Frighten decided not to delay. It was time to clarify things. The whole point was the status of the first princess, Eileen. Little Renee seemed to be hearing for the first time about the struggle for the throne in the Kingdom of Utah. Internal conflicts were common among heirs to the royal blood, and the struggle for leadership often turned bloody. But Eileen was different. Not only is she perfect in terms of politics, diplomacy, and magic, she has literally transformed herself into an undisputed figure of power. Even though the third princess could have enlisted the support of the aristocrats and formed an opposition, everyone stayed away. The reason was obvious. The first princess did not persecute her siblings. On the contrary, she sincerely forgave them and welcomed them with open arms. This behavior nullified any attempts to oppose her. No one wanted to risk Eileen's wrath and at the same time saw no point in approaching Elendelle. Renee wanted to know more. And Volberg, knowing a lot, continued. In her youth, Eileen stood alone against the world. She had neither allies nor protectors. Everything seemed to be heading towards disaster, but suddenly, everyone who spoke out against it disappeared without a trace. No explanation, no evidence, only rumors that have since crept into aristocratic circles. Since then, the shadow of the first princess has become something best avoided. The conversation slowly turned to the topic of recent events in Leatherwell. Elendelle could not tell anything, so asked Casey. All she could say was that the knights had handled everything, and by the way, she had seen one of the teachers at the auction. It was at this moment that a familiar name flashed through Freuden's mind, Roger Salisi. It seemed to him that this person was already part of his past. To begin with, it is worth mentioning an important and rather tragic piece of news. The Magic Festival, which took place every year at Theon Academy, was decided to be postponed indefinitely. The rector turned out to be absolutely right. After the recent events in the city, as well as in connection with the preparation for the second part of the exams, the students simply would not have the strength or resources for entertainment. Roger was relieved at the news, as he had expected Esmeralda to become more active in such a crowded place. He desperately needed to find a way to force her to reveal her identity, and a crowd like this could be a convenient excuse. Even more intrusively, memories of the great fires of Loton swirled in his mind. Only 3 people survived this disaster: Esmeralda herself, Piero, and another unknown person. Roger understood that he could not delay. He had to leave for Loton as soon as possible. However, her thoughts were unexpectedly interrupted by Flora's visit. The girl came to pick up her element, which she had not had time to pick up earlier. Roger explained that the artifact was just one of 4 fragments, deliberately divided. But Flora was more interested in the strange magic she had recently seen in his laboratory. It wasn't about the Klein flask, but about the cube depicted on the board. It turned out to be a tesseract, a so-called supercube associated with magic that transcends the boundaries of space and time. To put it simply, it was about spatial magic, which could be the key to analyzing global anomalies. After a brief explanation, the conversation came to an end, but as they parted, Flora unexpectedly asked if everything was okay with the professor's body. She immediately added awkwardly that it was probably a stupid question, and it was better to pretend like nothing had happened. Later, Roger and Hans went on a little trip. Their destination was the abandoned village of Loton. There they quickly found a blind artist. From the first minutes, a sincere conversation began between them. Although the man had not seen the world, he felt it extremely deeply. And even more, the protagonist did not expect to see real magic embodied in an ordinary canvas. The artist did not understand who exactly was standing in front of him, but he felt a powerful aura in Roger. And the nature around him seemed to whisper that before him was the very hero who had saved the world from a terrible disaster. This meant that one could speak without hidden innuendo, about the tragic events of the past, about the fires of Loton, and most importantly, about those who survived that hell. To more accurately convey the events, Pierrot used his unique magic. In an instant, reality changed. Everything around turned into a painted picture. A bright, windswept village appeared before them. But the greatest pride was her, a girl whose appearance the artist was never able to convey. His skills simply did not allow him to paint that face, that sincerity and beauty that everyone who spoke to her at least once saw. She was kind to everyone, had an exceptional connection with the spirits, and they, in turn, reciprocated her kindness. Her name was Esmeralda. She didn't just live in Loton, she also survived that tragedy. It was she, Esmeralda, who was the ray of light that helped Pierrot stay in Loton. Her presence created a special atmosphere in the village. Warm, lively, and genuine. Everyone around felt her influence. With her, life seemed brighter, calmer. However, this ideal world could not withstand the onslaught when one of the aristocratic families came to Loton. From then on, everything began to rapidly collapse. However, that ideal world was destroyed with the arrival of a family of aristocrats. A rich young man said that he fell in love with Esmeralda at first sight, and the innocent girl did not even doubt his words. Of course, there was no love there. The nobleman simply craved the power that came from the spirits. So the villagers did not stay away when they learned about the proposal. They did not want Esmeralda to live an unhappy life in the cold world of aristocrats. When one of the brave men openly opposed it, the others followed him. But that's when disaster struck. The nobleman, angered by the disobedience, ordered everything to be destroyed. Every inhabitant, every house. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre, cruel, bloody, merciless. And it was this act that became the true cause of the fire of Loton. Not an accidental calamity, but a deliberate punishment. Esmeralda begged to stop this madness, trying to save at least someone. But the man she considered her fiancé forced her to look at this hell so that, as he said, she would know her place. Her tears, mixed with despair and anger, gave birth to the first fire spirits. She was no longer afraid, she had rebelled. She cursed all the murderers and wished them to burn to death. Her magic exploded with a soul scream, and from that moment on, fire consumed everything around her. The final word belonged to Quasimodo. That day, Pierrot went blind. His body was on the verge of death, and only a chance encounter saved his life. A little girl pulled him out of the fire, recognizing him as a wandering artist who often wandered aimlessly through the streets. She said that for an artist, losing his sight is a tragedy, but at that time he felt only gratitude for the chance to live. But she thought it would be better if she died with everyone. After all, the residents were killed just for daring to oppose the authorities. Having said this, she left without giving her name. Pierrot never saw her again. He stayed in Loton. This place became his home. It was here that he was first accepted, here that he first felt like a part of something. So he swore to protect this place until the end. Over time, he learned to put magic in his paintings and returned to art, creating canvases in which magic lived. Thus ended his story. Interestingly, if Roger were a different person, he would never have been revealed such a truth. But in that painted world, Pierrot saw everything: emotions, views, intentions. And it was thanks to this sincerity that I was able to trust the hero. Finally, he asked for one thing: to help the two girls who survived. Because somewhere in the world they wander alone, carrying within them unbearable pain in the shadow of the past. Well, there are so many exciting events happening around, But it's time to return to the students of Theon Academy. They were starting the second stage of their exams. And, as everyone knows, their task was to create a magic circle. Flora Loomis chose hexagons that resembled a turtle shell and made no mistakes in her calculations. Her work was brilliant, so the girl deservedly received the highest grade. After a long list of students, only little Renee was left in line. She was quite surprised. Her magic circle was not depicted at all. Immediately, whispers and discussion arose among the students. However, the girl explained that she had created a circle, but its structure was too complex for a simple drawing, so she intended to use the space to showcase her concept. Renee thought for a long time about how best to implement her idea. But it was the book about attributeless magic that became the inspiration that helped. The protagonist was genuinely surprised when he saw a three-dimensional magic circle in front of him. Professor Roger even regretted that the highest grade was only an A with a plus. It was truly exceptional work. It turned out that Renee's mana acted instinctively, without direct control on her part. The book probably only activated hidden potential. Previously, it was believed that attributeless magic was inferior to ordinary attributes. But as soon as its bearer created a complex three-dimensional magic circle, it became obvious that this was not a weakness, but a special kind of magic, perhaps related to spatial magic. Although such magic is not officially recognized in this world, the protagonist himself once created something similar. And if Renee's abilities are truly related to spatial changes, then her power will become invaluable. But it is worth mentioning another incident that happened during the next exam. Once everyone had completed the written part, the teacher decided to touch on the topic of mana transfer, a complex process of interaction between two people. In case of problems in the process, a strange phenomenon may occur. Complete amnesia. A former student gave Madame Marisa talismans that can partially simulate this effect so that students can experience it for themselves. They were a new development and only worked in pairs. Two students had already tested the talismans, and the girl learned about the boy's betrayal. Now it was the turn of the third princess and Renee. The girls poured some mana into the talismans, and immediately a strange feeling appeared, as if a very long time had passed. Renee muttered something about Elendelle's birthday, saying she shouldn't invite students she barely knew. The princess, in turn, saw images from Renee's head, memories that seemed like the distant past. I expected to see the events through the eyes of the girl herself, but it turned out that I was watching from the sidelines. Perhaps the prospect of her mother appeared before her. There was a hut in the meadow where they were alone. The happiness in their eyes was real, and Renee seemed completely tiny. However, the girl did not understand what the princess was talking about. After all, she grew up alone, without parents. Elendelle was stunned. Did Renee really have no memory of her parents? However, she knew well that visions during amnesia could not be fabricated. They were the transmission of true memories through magical power. The girl still remembered her teacher, who had educated her since she was 10 years old. But her memory of that time remained blank. Elendelle suspected that it was that mentor who might have been responsible for the loss of her memories. The very fact that Renee couldn't remember her mother scared her to death. But the princess tried to calm her friend down. Memory can always be restored, and perhaps the girl's parents were still alive. She truly wanted to help because, for her, Renee had become the first true friend in Theon. Frighten did not expect to meet Elendelle again in his cozy shelter. But he didn't come alone either. With him was Henry Presto, the same guy who had recently helped Renee with her part-time job. And, like last time, the guy had another offer. Renee immediately agreed without thinking. Frighten sarcastically remarked that the princess seemed to have forgotten that commoners did not have the same privileges as she did. Despite the improvement in the situation thanks to the rector, the gap between classes remained deep. In the end, young Volberg decided to leave. It became difficult to relax in his place because of some of the guests, and time was running out. He had another conversation about marriage waiting for him. The Loomis family insisted on strengthening ties through a wedding, and this was not the first time. Frieden was surprised when Flora herself appeared. Just recently, she had been turning up her nose disdainfully. The guy decided to touch on the topic of Roger Celici. He was interested in learning more about the professor, but the girl remained cold. She was only interested in the reason for refusing the marriage. Frieden muttered something about how he was going to refuse anyway, and that was why the dinner was so bland. He planned to just run away. Before leaving, Flora asked one more question. She was interested in the mandrake. She had heard that the dried plant had a good effect on the body, and she wanted to know where she could get it. Meanwhile, the protagonist is puzzled by the news that duels between professors are to take place at the festival. Roger had enough to worry about without this incident. The silence from Black Dawn after the banquet incident was particularly alarming. There was a feeling that Esmeralda was already planning something. But his thoughts were interrupted when Hans suddenly called out to him. Finally, I managed to find someone who fit the description. 2 hours later, Roger was standing in front of the right house. The owner ignored him at first, but then the door burst open, and the magic blow almost hit the guest. The protagonist managed to defend himself and immediately grabbed the owner, calming him down. He didn't need conflict. He just wanted to talk to Professor Crollo Fabius. I will tell you briefly about the ducal family of Fabius. Roger remembered well how, after the Bloody Night, all the aristocracy had disappeared from the kingdom of Daudera. Hans studied this phenomenon for a long time and found out that starting from a certain day, members of the Fabius family disappeared one by one without a trace. People began to whisper about the curse, and not without reason. A fire suddenly broke out in their estate. It was then that the last official head of the family burned to death. Only one of them survived. The most interesting thing is that he lived among everyone, right here in Theon. The protagonist acted cautiously and thoughtfully during the meeting. He showed a badge that is only given to members of the secret forces. Crollo was genuinely happy to think that Roger had come to protect him. After all, it was he who had dealt with the fire monster during that ill-fated banquet. And suddenly, Phoebus himself spoke. He said that she was a devil in human form who wanted him dead again. At the banquet, he was certain that he would be roasted just like the others. Roger wondered why Esmeralda was so interested in this young man. But to understand this, he needed to know more. He asked for a description of the woman's appearance, but Crollo could not recall anything specific. Except for black hair, age about 25, pretty face. However, there was another fact. She left a letter for Crollo, in which she wrote that she would come to pick him up on the last day of the festival. The situation looked serious, so Roger had no choice but to use the boy as bait. All Crollo had to do was do nothing. And the festival has finally begun. Professor Roger and Selena were touring the area. The young lady was telling something cheerfully with a smile, while the protagonist was lost in his own thoughts. Only a light touch on his cheek brought him back to reality. He muttered that his head was in chaos, and Selena only assumed it was because of the professorial duels tomorrow. As they walked on, they came across a group of their students. Leo, Aiden, Tracy, and their new friend were standing by the shooting range. The owner of the attraction immediately grabbed a new viewer, began advertising the shooting range, and even boldly called Roger a dude who couldn't even shoot a gun. The students instantly came to the defense of their mentor, but the professor decided to respond differently, with action. His shots were flawless, without a single miss, and the record was broken. The lucky owner immediately offered a prize, the work of a local toy maker. It was a strange but beautiful creature, similar to the beast of Gévaudan. The students were just beaming with joy when they received this contraption. Selena looked pleased too. She loved seeing children's smiles, real and sincere. The day seemed warm, light, and full of pleasant bustle. The festival was just beginning, with 4 more bright days ahead. But this moment was interrupted by an unexpected movement. Crollo Fabius flashed past them. The protagonist immediately rushed after him into the dark alley. Crollo shouted that the devil was dead. Roger threw Phoebus away from the girl with a weak magical shot. He began to explain that he had acted according to plan, but he was being watched the whole time, and he couldn't stand it anymore. Yes, he managed to catch this girl, but Khaleesi couldn't believe that everything had been so simple. Professor Selena unexpectedly appeared on the scene. Seeing what was happening, she immediately fainted. Roger wanted Crollo to move her away, but the man froze, began to tremble, and silently pointed with his finger. And suddenly everything changed. Selena began to transform. She spoke up, saying she wasn't going to do anything until the end of the festival, but she didn't understand why he decided to betray her trust. Before them stood the real Esmeralda of the First Order. She was even boring. Crollo fainted just at the sight of her. The protagonist was stunned. He couldn't believe that Selena had a split personality. Esmeralda was sure that Roger would quickly figure her out, even before the first conversation. After all the participants in the First Order meetings hid their true faces. The protagonist didn't understand what she was getting at. That girl made no secret of her intention to kill Crollo and complete her revenge. She also said that Selena knows nothing. She is pure, innocent, like a girl from the past, before she was maimed by that terrible man. Roger could see that Esmeralda was acting recklessly. And if he had attacked, the blow would have been fatal. However, a second person would have died with her. Professor Selena. The choice was difficult. And then the spirit of Quasimodo appeared. His appearance forced Roger to retreat. Esmeralda wasn't looking for a fight either. She only asked to watch over Selena because she really liked the professor. An unconscious woman slowly fell into the protagonist's arms. Her appearance gradually changed, and it was hard for the eyes to believe this entire transformation. It was here that Roger realized where he had gone wrong. Joanna Lovett was the girl who had pulled Pierrot out of the fire. And, strangely enough, she followed Esmeralda and joined the Black Dawn. Even knowing the whole truth, Roger couldn't decide whether he could kill Selena. Would it be right if she doesn't even suspect the existence of her second dark side? Fortunately, everything went smoothly. Selena came to her senses and didn't remember anything. She just said that she wanted to enjoy the festival with him next year. Roger promised that it would be so. But while he was keeping this promise in mind, someone broke into his office, and the pills disappeared. A stranger took them. Well, the second day of the Magic Festival started off quite brightly. Almost the entire academy gathered in the arena stands. Everyone was waiting for the duel between the professors. Moreover, among the guests were many important and famous people from all over the empire. Even representatives of the great ducal families came. Everyone was eagerly awaiting the opening of the competition. The first to enter the arena were the freshman mentor Matthew and the popular newcomer among the professors, Roger Kellichi. It seems that this battle will not be easy, although the protagonist himself was not eager to waste his strength for the sake of the audience. Roger tried his best to show that he was ready to lose and accept defeat. But his opponent was afraid, suspecting that Saliti was up to something. As a result, his strongest attack turned out to be too weak for Roger. The protagonist had to win, even though he expected to lose in the next round. And the second duel was disappointing. He wasn't even given a chance to lose with dignity. So, Roger made it to the finals. It wasn't easy, as he was literally absorbing mana with every breath. But when he returned to the office, the pills were gone. There were clear shoe marks on the floor, but surprisingly, the robber only took medicine. The final has begun, and the opponent was Mentor Devian. Before the fight, he decided to chat with the legendary Chelichi. Devian hinted that he knew everything, and pulled out a bottle of pills. Roger immediately understood who had entered his office, but he didn't understand how this guy had learned about his condition. He demanded that Deviant cancel the match and give the medicine, and then he would simply forget about the situation. But he only scoffed, saying he wasn't interested in any excuses. But Roger wasn't joking. He was serious and wanted to surrender before his magic completely disappeared. However, Devian was only happy, considering it a brilliant bluff. He activated a 4th-level protective spell, a powerful barrier that blocked both internal and external attacks. And yet suddenly something struck Roger. It turned out that Devian had a familiar, a snake that attacked from within. The protagonist understood that he would not last long without pills. He was getting worse and worse, and even the university president noticed it. However, no one stopped the duel. Suddenly, Devian saw something above Roger's head, a strange black hole. It seemed as if invisible voices were telling him to be quiet. A force of incredible magnitude and unknown origin burst onto the arena. But to the spectators, it seemed as if the bright sun had blinded the entire arena. But all that was visible to Mentor Devian was a giant black hole. The protagonist barely controlled himself, muttering quietly that he was right after all. You and I saw Roger's true power for the first time, and honestly, I was fascinated. How many more secrets was he hiding? But it is certain that he is indeed incredibly strong. In a moment, Roger pulled himself together, and all the magic immediately disappeared. Only Professor Deviant lay unconscious on the floor. It seemed that our professor's victory was undeniable. Later, everyone gathered in the medical department. The protagonist explained that it was a simple mental shock that would pass with time. The vice-chancellor, pathetic and self-righteous, tried to blame Roger. But the rector reminded him that it was he who did not allow the duel to be stopped. Besides, a bunch of people had already gathered at the medical center. Everyone wanted to see the unrivaled Roger Chelichi in person. The first to approach was Hybek Kata, the head of the ducal family. Grandpa mumbled something, but made it clear that the protagonist could always turn to him. Roger saw right through this sly man who just wanted to make a profitable contact. But Hybek was no fool and quickly backed down when he realized he wouldn't get anything just like that. And this meant that we were not just dealing with a representative of one of the 3 great ducal families. Despite his friendly demeanor, this man was carefully analyzing everything around him with every movement he made. Well, now Roger was going to go to Hans and Sheridan. But on the way, he accidentally met Flora. He warned her that her father was busy right now. The girl seemed offended and replied that she had not come to see him at all. Loomis seemed to accidentally mention that she also participated in battles and invited the professor to take a look if he was interested. After that, Roger went to his friend's house. It was time to organize a vacation for little Sheridan. They went to a golem exhibition held by Theon's professors. They demonstrated the latest development called DT-3000. If a mana stone was inserted inside as a fuel source, the golem's shape would change. The protagonist felt like this thing had come straight out of a Transformers movie. While Sheridan was admiring the exhibits, Roger noticed something frightening. Casey Selmoy. The protagonist tried to remain calm because she couldn't easily recognize him. Roger even decided to hide his identity using light magic. It's quite difficult for people to recognize someone who has changed even slightly. Although Professor Celici was still visibly nervous, he politely pointed out to Casey which direction the arena was. But the girl suddenly wondered if they had met before. My heart almost jumped. But the protagonist dryly replied that he was seeing her for the first time and hurried to leave. Selmoy asked him to stop because she recognized him as the professor. The detective quickly put her guesses together and calculated that it was Roger Celici in front of her. However, the hero was not going to linger and disappeared again. Casey was disappointed. She hadn't seen such a cold reaction to her phenomenal abilities in a long time, unless it's from James Moriarty. In the end, she left her business card and suggested that I contact her if the need arose. The protagonist understood that it could have been worse if she had exposed him completely, although maybe Selmoy just wanted to make friends. Roger advised Hans to lie down and get rid of the clothes they had worn during that affair. After all, even such trifles could become a clue. Casey should not be underestimated. After that, they watched Sheridan. The girl cheerfully shared her interests, and a large number of interested listeners gathered around. Hans noted that professorship was Roger's true calling. He smiled as if he were genuinely happy for him. He admitted that he himself would feel out of place in such surroundings. It was clear that Hans was a little jealous of the academy. Roger could feel the difference too. Against their backdrop, the students truly seemed like magical flowers growing in a peaceful, magical garden. But the troubles that existed outside the academy were not these children's fault. So why shouldn't they be happy and keep smiling? The main thing is whether he was prepared for the consequences. After all, he already had something in common with Professor Selena. The protagonist knew. He had already experienced something similar, and he understood that innocent people would suffer, no matter how hard he tried to avoid it. If you don't kill the enemy, you will die yourself. That's the way it is in this world, where death is always nearby. All these heavy thoughts were left behind. On the third day, a banquet was held in Theon under the open sky. That grandfather picked on Roger again, and this time the professor decided not to stand on ceremony, immediately asking what he wanted. Hebeck immediately understood his interlocutor's mood and admitted that he was only interested in the spectacle. It turned out that Grandpa knew Lumos well. He said that she had a unique talent, but life was cruel to her. Flora's family shunned her because she was illegitimate. Meanwhile, the girl herself tried to calm down. She wanted to say hello to her family at least once and show them how much she had changed. Flora was about to call her father, but her brother and younger sister were the first to notice her. They immediately began teasing the half-breed, and her father coldly asked what she wanted. Her voice trembled. She began to doubt why she had come at all, but a warm, confident touch saved her. Professor Roger asked if anyone had a problem with his student. The religious order of Lumensis, which oppresses demi-humans in the name of a single god, is guided by a special scripture about the true man. It is on this foundation that their church stands. They don't just shun others. Purebloods are considered the upper class, while demi-humans and their descendants belong to the lower. The church divides the world in two, not allowing any other views. It was not easy for Flora to grow up in a family of lumensists who oppressed her since childhood. The protagonist realized that perhaps this was why the girl was obsessed with learning. Shucks. She hoped that she would be recognized if she became the best student. But even if she succeeded, who would guarantee that her dream would actually come true? Roger acted impulsively. He understood that his intervention could only harm, but he could not turn a blind eye to the pain of others. Hebeck was surprised that Roger openly opposed the head of the Lumos family. Flora's father dryly replied that it was their family matter and asked not to interfere. But the protagonist was determined. As a professor, he could not stand aside. Unexpectedly, the younger sister intervened, speaking disparagingly of Flora and ridiculing her status. She introduced herself as Katrina Lumos and announced that she would be joining Theon next year. and she also demonstrated her abilities, hinting at a high level. The girl asked Roger to express his opinion as a professor at the academy, but the protagonist responded cunningly, completely criticizing her training. He especially emphasized that she had no right to discuss Flora at such a level. This caused a wave of discontent. People shouted that such behavior was unbecoming of Professor Theon. Hybeck intervened, asking everyone to calm down, and made a light remark to Roger. The head of the family apologized for his youngest daughter, saying she had behaved too childishly, and then simply left. Now you have a better understanding of what Flora's life was like. Her father had no intention of forgiving the professor for such disrespect. In addition, Roger learned a lot of interesting things about Duke Caden. His faith bordered on fanaticism. Flora was lucky to avoid being branded. The mark was supposed to leave a mark on her body, but it didn't happen thanks to her late mother. After all these events, Roger really needed a rest. So he decided to do something practical and went to a pharmaceutical laboratory. There he accidentally met his competitor, Chris Barrymore. The professor was surprised that this arrogant guy knew how to prepare medicine at all. Chris loudly declared that this is what he specializes in. Roger couldn't help but tease the teacher a little, and he himself took up the task of preparing medicine from ingredients that, in principle, could have killed someone. Barrymore immediately pointed out that combining such ingredients could cause serious side effects. At first, Chris didn't intend to meddle in Roger's affairs, but he couldn't contain his curiosity. He carefully followed every move. Without a single mistake and on the first try, the protagonist made pills to restore mana. Barrymore noticed that this drug was strikingly different from the classic formula. What kind of disease was this that required such powerful doses? But Chris was careless. He accidentally gave off the impression that he knew much more than he should have. He started to nervously make excuses, saying he just wanted to show Roger his place. In the end, he apologized for his pitiful act, which, according to him, was unbecoming of a true nobleman. He added that such pills can damage the pressure control system, so a special regulator should be used. The protagonist didn't even believe at first that someone was willing to help just like that. But Chris clearly shared professional ethics. When it came to the patient, personal motives did not matter. Such an unexpected conversation took place between two competitors. But time was short. After all, it was the last day of the festival, and this time, Esmeralda was definitely going to make her move. But Roger was worried about another one, Joanna Lovett. It was too dangerous to leave unattended, so the professor decided to involve his students. He wrote anonymous notes and slipped them under the doors of each of his 4 pupils. Roger didn't want to involve the youth, but it was the only way to keep an eye on Joanna. Whatever they do, the main thing is that the object does not disappear from sight. He himself had to check one more place. After that, all preparations would be complete. Meanwhile, Esmeralda was tormented by nightmares. She waited non-stop for the moment when it would all be over, when revenge would be accomplished. But she had no idea what would happen next. If she didn't stop, she would eventually destroy herself completely and never be the person she once was. Selena is a part of her that she created out of pain and an attempt to return to purity. Of course, she wanted to remain kind and naive. Esmeralda seriously considered stopping right now, but Quasimodo instantly suppressed these thoughts. He was shocked that she could even think of forgiving the one who was responsible for the deaths of her loved ones. The pressure from this strong spirit only reinforced her conviction. Revenge was her duty. And now the last night of the festival has arrived. Miss Selena quietly disappeared from the noisy crowd and quickly headed straight for the house of Crollo Fabius. Strangely, when Esmeralda entered the room, there was no one inside. But she definitely felt someone's presence. There was still a trace of something dark in the air. Meanwhile, Crollo hurried after a whole flock of mice, as if he were being led by some invisible guide. Mr. Fabius was even glad that at least someone hadn't left him alone. At this time, Hans informed Roger that the witch was almost there. The protagonist nodded in satisfaction. It was time to begin the operation. Even the students believed the notes and already set out in search of dangerous terrorists. Their surprise was incredible when they saw Joanna Lovett, together with strangers who definitely don't look like peaceful festival guests. But Crollo was out of luck. He ran to the abandoned hangar, where Esmeralda was already waiting for him. She appeared like a shadow, noting with displeasure that the boy still hadn't learned how to run properly. Phoebus cried out in despair, asking why she was chasing him. Hadn't she had enough? How far would he have to fall to make it stop? Yes, he had wiped out the entire village, but he had the right to do so. He was an aristocrat. The common people had interfered in their own affairs. It was their own fault. He believed that it was she who had ruined everything. He shouted that it was her fault. Her presence had brought death. Esmeralda couldn't believe how this bastard still dared to shift the blame onto her. But with every word he said, something in her head broke. She began to hear voices of the dead. They whispered that before her appearance, everyone lived peacefully, and only she brought grief. Panic gripped the girl. Fire erupted, and tears rolled down her cheeks. Hans immediately informed Roger that the situation was getting out of control. A pillar of flame shot into the sky. Everyone could see it. The protagonist already knew what had happened and asked Sheridan to distract the crowd. The fireworks immediately began, and the crowd froze in delight at the spectacle. This gave Roger a chance. Now all eyes were fixed on the sky, but there was no time. He definitely wouldn't have time to reach the hangar on foot. Demonstration golems stood nearby, and without hesitation, he transformed one of them into a mechanical horse. Roger raced towards Hans with furious speed. One glance was enough to understand that everything was much more serious than he had imagined. Quasimodo, the same spirit, was already there. Roger tried to talk to him, assuring him that he only wanted to help. And it seemed to him that the monster understood him at least a little. It's even a little strange. Everything didn't go according to plan, but that was precisely his advantage. Now he had a chance to make things right. However, getting close to Esmeralda proved difficult. Quasimodo didn't believe him from the very beginning, and wasn't going to let a stranger near the one he was guarding. Meanwhile, Casey Salmoy was leisurely strolling through the park, enjoying the evening air, when a group of suspicious strangers in dark cloaks caught her attention. She immediately became wary because one of them mentioned the words Black Dawn. At that moment, her eyes lit up with excitement. Something was finally happening. Casey decided to follow them quietly. The students didn't waste any time either. They had already slipped away and she was following them with a smile, like an experienced hunter of newcomers. But Roger, to put it mildly, was less fortunate. Quasimodo has already openly stated that he should have killed the professor even earlier. The protagonist watched in amazement as this golem acted independently, like an experienced warrior, without needing any orders. Is this the true power of the First Order of the Black Dawn? There was no time for reflection. Roger immediately used Aether Nocturnus, but even in the darkness the monster found him unerringly, like some mad shadow hunting for light. Roger felt the situation getting out of control, and he understood that if he released his divine power now, the consequences could be terrible. So the choice was obvious. No, he had to keep it to himself. His only chance is to defend himself while he still has strength. The golem summoned a magical shield, but even that was only a temporary protection. Roger had a plan. Using special pills, he significantly increased the level of mana in his body. However, now it needed to be released immediately. And this is what allowed him to reach rank 5 and use one of his most powerful spells, Wrath of the Ocean. Meanwhile, Aiden and his friends have already attacked Joanna. They felt like real heroes, reading her morals about goodness and not harming peaceful people. But Miss Lovett couldn't hold it in anymore. Rage flared in her eyes. For her, this holiday was built on the bones of the dead, and she decided to wipe these self-confident children off the face of the earth. Her attack was powerful. Aiden definitely wouldn't have survived if it weren't for Casey. She appeared just in time, like an action movie heroine, confident, precise, deadly serious. I think you like this ending too? Well, we'll hand this front over to the legendary detective. Let's get back to Roger. Quasimodo's power was not weakening, and it was becoming clear. Without even stronger magic, nothing would work. However, there was only enough mana left for 2 high-ranking spells. The professor remembered his teacher's lessons and decided to act cunningly. He intentionally overloaded his golem, and it began to break. But that was precisely what made its power soar to its maximum. Quasimodo was distracted. Roger won a few vital seconds. It's time to do something truly incredible. I will try to briefly but vividly convey all the events that are about to unfold. First, Joanna Lovett was already cornered. But suddenly all the kids raised their heads at the same time. Something appeared in the sky. Casey was immediately alert. Joanna was running straight towards the ship. If her suspicions are correct, then this is an ancient spell from a book she once studied. It was created by Lexler himself, a wandering wizard, and it was the ocean icebreaker. Finally, there was at least a tiny moment of silence. The protagonist understood. As soon as Esmeralda woke up, Quasimodo would gain new strength and return. Roger urgently needed to seal the monster, otherwise it would be the end. But this ritual requires a living soul. Unexpectedly, Esmeralda whispered to him to run away. If she lost control, she wouldn't be able to stop. Roger didn't immediately understand what was going on until he was hit by Quasimodo. The answer became obvious. The monster recovered from a 6th-level spell. Roger noticed the red thread that connected Esmeralda to the creature, and suddenly he was pulled into memories. He saw the scene, a dark creature devouring magic and multiplying the hatred of the contractors. It was something between a spirit and a cryptid. The stranger invited Quasimodo to join them and promised to fulfill any wish. Roger suddenly understood why the monster acted without commands. He was controlling Esmeralda himself, and before him was the first order of Quasimodo. But this realization came too late. He won't last long under these attacks. And suddenly, a soft, gentle voice. It was Selena. She said that everything was fine and asked Roger to do what he had planned. While she was asleep, she was able to feel the full horror of what she had done. She wished it would all be a nightmare, because the last few days had been too happy. Roger touched her forehead and whispered that it would all be over soon. She just had to wake up. Spirits appeared to help Selena. They rushed to distract the monster. Meanwhile, Roger began preparations for the 9th knot spell, one of the most powerful, stable, and fundamental. This was the magic of the Tree of Life itself. Can even Quasimodo withstand this? Esmeralda regained consciousness and asked John Doe why he had saved her. The protagonist calmly replied that he simply couldn't stand the way that creature looked down on him contemptuously. But the girl could not believe that such a powerful John Doe was really capable of something like that. And at that very moment, Quasimodo's paw grabbed her. The monster hissed that he would drag them all with him to the grave, and demanded even more strength from Esmeralda. Roger urgently needed to break this terrible connection, and the solution to win finally appeared: to use the body of Crollo Fabius. However, Joanna unexpectedly appeared before them. She silently, without any further words, attacked the monster. And it worked. Quasimodo's strength weakened with every passing moment. The girl didn't have time to say a word when another participant in the drama suddenly appeared: Pierrot himself. After talking to Roger, he realized that he had to face the past face-to-face. He admitted that he had lost himself, but thanks to the spirit within him, he did not completely lose his way. But Quasimodo wasted no time. The fiery hands rushed into battle again. Pierrot, despite his own exhaustion, was able to blind the monster. And this brief moment, gifted by the artist, turned out to be key in this battle. Chains encircled the creature's body. The ritual was supposed to rewrite the old contract through the intervention of a stronger force. But Quasimodo, through the pain, still drew strength from Esmeralda. He roared that their bond could not be broken. That girl has already decided everything for herself. If this is what the creature so desires, she will give everything. Her body, her magic, even her own life, to give Selena her freedom. The monster couldn't believe that she was really going to die with him. But Roger managed to stop her. He severed this bond of souls, ruthlessly but decisively. The professor knew perfectly well that this wouldn't make things any easier. They all had to finally stop lying to themselves. And it was this act that gave rise to a true miracle. Thousands of souls that were imprisoned in Quasimodo's body were finally freed. Esmeralda could not believe her eyes. The inhabitants of the village were free, but she herself began to lose her physical shape. Her relationship with Quasimodo was too long. The girl was gradually becoming a ghost. Almost transparent now, she saw her younger sister's soul before her, and I realized that it was time for them to leave. Together, they dissolved into the light, leaving behind a dirty, broken, and cruel world. And Roger stayed. He knew that his path was still far from over, but he was sure that this day would definitely come. Pierrot finally felt that everything was over, but there was one last request left for the protagonist. Joni was to disappear from the academy grounds. She was to die for the Black Dawn tonight. She had to leave and never return. Pierrot promised to help. Thanks to his unusual magic, he could get her out unnoticed. So Joanna set off with Pierrot back to her native village, and Roger had a much more difficult task ahead of him. Professor Selena was still alive. Perhaps she and Esmeralda shared not only a body but also a soul. As soon as she opened her eyes, Roger asked her to wait a moment. The girl couldn't understand why she needed to be saved after everything she had done. Even if it was her other personality, the guilt still remained. But Roger remembered their promise to go to the festival together next year. That was the reason for her salvation. Even I was surprised by how nobly our protagonist acted. Professor Selena was moved to tears. She looked at the fireworks in the sky with childlike delight and also wanted to keep that promise. The students sincerely hoped that she was okay, although Casey Selmoy kept a close eye on Roger. Something was troubling her. The detective also noticed the disappearance of Joanna, a well-known member of the Black Dawn. Is all this just a coincidence? Thanks to the coordinated actions of Hans and Roger, all traces were destroyed. So, when the professor reports to the rector, he can consider the mission accomplished. But as soon as Roger sat down on the bench, his breath caught. A stranger just appeared behind him and praised John Doe for his excellent work. The protagonist froze. He didn't feel this person approaching at all, and the voice was strangely familiar. It was the same voice that sounded in Quasimodo's memories. And now everything became clear. Before him stood the Zero Order of the Black Dawn. This mysterious man arrived at the festival and accidentally got caught up in the maelstrom of events. He wanted to hear the truth about everything that had happened. Roger was most afraid that he would not find out about Quasimodo's death, but it seemed that the Zero Order didn't know anything for sure. So it was better to keep its cool and proceed with caution. The professor immediately apologized for his confusion, and he began. He announced that the First Order, Quasimodo, was dead. Yes, he didn't look human, but he still had a master. However, the Zero Order needed more. They were interested in the details of the death. Roger acted with the utmost caution. He explained that Quasimodo had been sealed by Crolla Fabius. Apparently, the Order had doubts. Esmeralda couldn't just stand there and watch her spirit being attacked, and even Crolla didn't have that much power. The protagonist couldn't reveal all the cards, so he said that, as Professor Theon knew, he was patrolling the outskirts of the academy, and that's where he came across Crollo. Then the boy was attacked by Quasimodo and Esmeralda. Even before that, at the banquet, the girl turned to Roger and asked for support. This confirmed, the professor knew about the revenge plan. He continued to tell the story as if he were observing the situation from the sidelines, trying to foresee the worst possible outcome. Roger went on to say that cornered, Phoebus was forced to resort to despair. He performed the ritual, using his soul as a sacrifice. Because of this, Quasimodo did not have time to carry out his revenge. He was dragged into the seal, along with Esmeralda. Their souls were connected, and Roger did not intervene, otherwise he would have been exposed. Finally, he remembered that Professor Selena had survived, so he himself was able to safely leave the scene. The Zero Order seems to have accepted the explanation. He announced that after this, the position of the First Order was now vacant, which means that the Great Gathering of the Black Dawn's top leadership would soon take place. He also added that there hadn't been such meetings for a very long time, and unexpectedly asked about a certain subject. Roger immediately realized that it was some kind of key. He remembered that part of his luggage had been lost on the train. And then the incredible happened. The Zero Order showed mercy. He gave Roger back some of what he had lost, said goodbye, and simply disappeared. The protagonist felt weakness take over his body. Consciousness slowly faded away. Roger fell right at the feet of headmistress Eliza Willow. Of course, Mrs. Willow was sincerely concerned about the professor's condition. At the first meeting at the hospital, she learned all the key details. The names of Crollo and Joanna Lovett were also mentioned. It turned out that both were directly involved in the incident with the Almighty Stone. Eliza understood perfectly well. The root of all evil lies in the organization of the Black Dawn. But now she had to take care of these matters herself. The professors were advised to rest. Both Roger and Selena were doing well at the moment, so our hero could finally relax a little. Roger decided to check if he had both mysterious objects left behind. One was a gift from the Zero Order. The other was an amber stone that appeared after Quasimodo's death. The ring given by the Zero Order was an unusual artifact. Inside it was a magical seal that was activated only when the jewelry was placed on the finger. It seemed to be a sleep spell, magic that transported consciousness into the world of dreams. And surprisingly, it was all for the better. There, Roger could learn more about the other First Orders. The next significant event was Casey Selma's unexpected visit to the rector. The detective was determined to help with the investigation, and at the same time, she had a request of her own. Her report matched with astonishing accuracy what Roger had previously reported. But something still made Eliza doubt. It seemed like she was missing something. However, although their collaboration was short, it left a clear mark. The rector agreed. Selmoy would receive permission to interrogate everyone who had contact with the secret organization. After all, she wasn't just investigating. She was openly hunting them. And now, I want to share something really good. Students visited Roger in the hospital room. Flora Lumos came in person to make sure the professor was okay. But she was interrupted by an excited Aiden who rushed into the room almost from the threshold. Renee and the third princess followed. Roger felt pleased. It was not for nothing that he was the professor they were reaching for. The latest to join the company was Frieden Volberg. His appearance, and especially his words, came as a surprise. The guy turned to the professor, noting that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. But Roger had no idea what it was about. Frieden finally admitted that he had made a mistake. Perhaps he had indeed made a mistake. The girls didn't pay any attention to this, deciding that Volberg, as usual, was muttering something under his breath. But a moment later, Frieden asked to speak to Roger alone. The guy admitted. At first it seemed to him that all this was just guesswork. But when Renee received the same book about attributeless magic, he realized there had been no mistake. Frieden knew who this book belonged to. It could only be owned by one person, the wielder of that rare power. But that man had long since died. And only Roger could have passed the book on to someone else. Frieden directly hinted, after everything that had happened, he had no right to appear so openly at the academy. The protagonist understood. It was worth being more careful. It was better to hide his true essence. He remembered well who the Volbergs were, and therefore who Frieden was. And here the most important thing came out. The guy said bluntly, "It's time for Roger to tell everything he's been hiding." After all, he was the one who killed Renee's mother. Frieden demanded at least some kind of answer. Roger's silence troubled him. He wanted the truth. He wanted an explanation. But the protagonist himself believed that nothing needed to be explained. All this is just an echo of the past. Besides, he ended up in Theon not because of the events of 12 years ago. Frieden sincerely wanted to get to the truth, but Roger didn't feel like himself during the interrogation. His response was sharp. He said that the guy saw everything himself that day and decided to keep quiet. If he had doubts now, then let him do whatever he wanted. But the professor knew very well that Frieden would do nothing. He was too broken, although at the same time angry. When the boy saw Renee, he seemed to dare to tell her the truth. But it was worth looking into her eyes. And the memories came flooding back with new force. The words got stuck in my throat. He simply left without saying a word. Frieden couldn't tell Renee that the professor she trusted with all her heart had actually killed her mother and erased her memories. Without evidence, it would sound absurd, and it would also break her heart. He just didn't want to hurt her, and Roger himself didn't look calm. He didn't want any of this to happen either, so that the past comes back to life. So that old mistakes burn again like fresh wounds. To distract himself a bit, he immediately contacted Hans. He wanted to talk about the festival. The fire was blamed on a technical malfunction with the fireworks to avoid unnecessary noise. Several members of the Black Dawn had been captured and were currently being interrogated by Casey Selmoy. The situation was being resolved within the academy, so we could breathe a sigh of relief. However, Roger asked Hans for a personal meeting. There was one important topic. So far, everything was stable with their business. But recently, competitors have started to stir things up. The protagonist didn't immediately understand what was going on, so Hans explained directly. When a business grows, there are more enemies, and they try to put a damper on it. But this time, something strange happened. The previously annoying rivals suddenly disappeared from the radar. And Hans already had his suspicions. Everything pointed to the Silver Sun, a once small gang that had grown into a real mafia corporation. They interfered in the affairs of merchants, removed undesirables, blackmailed and profited from other people's problems. Hans's rats had seen several competitors enter Silver Sun headquarters. Roger understood everything, and he promised to be especially vigilant. However, Hans still noticed that something was wrong with his brother. Roger was nervous. His leg was shaking on its own. His face was covered in cold sweat. And at some point he remembered. He had forgotten something incredibly important. His mistress. She could have found out where he was. She could have woken up, and it seems she has. She smelled her own blood. After all, it was the blood he had used. The blood the student had stolen while running away. And he used it without thinking about the consequences. She taught him well. So why did he risk it? It seems Roger was pretty pressed for time to take such a step. And the lady, she was pleased. She knew that now he wouldn't run away, and she was sincerely waiting for her favorite student to finally make her truly happy. Hans couldn't believe his ears. Could his teacher really be the god of death himself? Roger just shrugged and confirmed with a smile. Something very similar. It was she who taught him all those tricks that now amaze others. And Hans, naive, considered his brother a self-taught genius. However, Roger reminded me that most of the techniques were just adaptations of other people's ideas. He never sought to make a social achievement out of it, because even what he managed to create rarely delighted his teacher. Hans was amazed. If what Roger had learned was already a dream level for most magicians, then who was his mentor? The protagonist declared without emotion, "She is a real monster." And it was because of her that he teetered on the brink of death more than once. A few days passed. Roger had business on King Street, where he had not appeared since the Esmeralda affair. His thoughts wandered in the clouds until his eyes suddenly focused on a familiar figure, Priest Bradus. What were these creatures doing in Leatherwake? It was bad. Very bad. However, there was no time. The protagonist was in a hurry to Violetta's clothing store, known as Verdi's house. The street was bustling with life. People were full of enthusiasm, and Roger briefly shared this with his friend. However, she immediately became wary when he mentioned the meeting with the leader. What? Is this the case again? Violetta knew about the problems with competitors, but hoped to solve everything on her own. But lately, suspicious types have been increasingly hanging around the store. Roger wanted to hear more, but their conversation was suddenly interrupted by news. There had been an attack. The factory was set on fire. The fire spread at a furious pace. And then something strange happened. The stone left behind by Quasimodo began to glow dimly. He began to consume the flames. The fire has stopped. But now the main thing is to save the victims. When Roger was told that Theon and Mastella had disappeared, his face turned pale. You may not remember them, but they were his loyal allies. He immediately rushed to search, and I found him, in a house covered in blood, among corpses. Poor Mastella lay beside Theon's dead body, explaining in a trembling voice that a stranger had broken into the house. Grandpa rushed to protect her, and fell. She sobbed. Just as they had hoped for a normal life, everything collapsed again. The protagonist cautiously asked her to wait outside, promising to do everything in his power, and ordered not to enter under any circumstances. He lifted the seal. The creature appeared. Roger had given clear orders to save Theon. If she refused, he would call someone else. But if he helps, he will receive a generous reward. And a miracle happened. Theon, alive, though wounded, returned to Mastella. This time they survived. And Roger himself found a watch with the symbol at the crime scene. Violetta recognized it immediately. The sign of the silver sun. Roger's patience ran out. He decided to act. Alone, without help. Like a wild beast, he burst into the den of the scoundrels and instantly killed one of the guards. And when they asked him who he was, he replied that it was Jack. Roger reached the palace without any obstacles, swiftly, like a shadow. His goal was clear, to meet with the head of Silver Sun. And it seems that he was already waiting for the Lord of the Alleys. Carlin had deliberately made a fuss since morning. He knew it would force Roger to show up in person. He greeted the guest with a sly smile and asked if he liked the gift. After all, they said, there was so much screaming at that factory. The protagonist sat down silently. He hadn't come to chat, he just wanted to hear his enemy justify himself. But Carlin seemed to be deliberately trying to anger him. He even felt scared. The pressure that filled the room was inhuman. And he still thought that Roger just had a strange nickname. But despite his fear, Carlin didn't stop. He started talking nonsense, saying, how could such a simpleton be able to rise to power on his own? He urged Roger to stop pretending to be a hero and just surrender. In response, he even promised to recall the guys he had already sent to the alleys. Roger didn't argue. He simply stated briefly and bluntly that he was shocked by the man's low standards. And he added that violence is normal for them, but now they will have to answer in full. His personal team was already dealing with the attackers on the streets, and the protagonist himself instantly assessed the situation. He was surrounded by all the fighting forces of the Silver Sun, and then Roger just disappeared. Carlin was exhausted, and strange things started happening in the room. Black tentacles stretched from the ceiling, like shadows from a nightmare. They targeted the guards. Roger, from across the room, calmly asked Carlin, does he believe in God? For the being to whom these tentacles belonged was the goddess herself. She had once had a name, had power, but she had been betrayed and cursed, branded an evil deity. She lost the meaning of her existence. But she did not lose her love for people. So all-encompassing, so insane, that it was now forming its body from the people themselves. Her appearance was terrifying. but she could heal any wound while her heart was still beating. It was thanks to her that Roger saved the life of a loved one. And today he offered the goddess reward, the guilty. Everyone who caused that tragedy. That's how we learned the main secret of his power. Roger managed to make a pact with the goddess herself. How? It still remains a mystery. Meanwhile, the streets were being cleaned up. Roger's team dealt with all the Silver Sun fighters without any fuss. The operation was swift and ruthless. The group was destroyed. And they did all this for the sake of the ordinary residents of Leatherbeck. The very next morning, the commander of the Night Serpents, Enya, received a detailed report. It became known that the Silver Sun took root precisely in the poor areas of the city. This thing was just gaining momentum. The crime scene looked too perfect. Not a trace, not a drop of blood, as if there had never been a massacre. The captain decided to use the newest artifact, a device that read mana and memories encrypted in the air. The analysis was supposed to take some time so they could finish the conversation. There were rumors in the city about the mysterious Pan, who appeared after the disappearance of the Silver Sun and quickly conquered the underground. He had no past, no real name, too suspicious to ignore. Tarina already knew. Sooner or later the meeting would be inevitable. Unexpectedly, the artifact stopped working. No mana was detected in the place. It seems that no witchcraft was used here. According to available information, Silver Sun had about 100 guards, traces of which were discovered the day before. But they all disappeared without any explanation. Magic? Maybe. But for now, the investigation has reached a dead end, and Tarina has decided to act directly. As the team was about to depart, the captain drew her sword, ordering the stranger to step out of the shadows. A familiar female voice answered her call. Casey Selmo appeared before them. She was sincerely happy to meet Tarina and her assistant. Together they had once fought the Beast of Gévaudan. However, the Night Serpents reminded us that this was a crime scene, where outsiders had no place. Selmoy just smiled. Her status as a national detective allowed her a little more than ordinary agents. She admitted that she couldn't help herself, it was too interesting. And of course, she was most interested in the artifact with mana. Tarina just sighed, not objecting as expected. Casey promised to return soon, but for now, the snakes headed for the slums. Hans's rats overheard every word and immediately reported everything to the owner. Roger knew that Tarina was not to be fooled, so it was better to meet her in person. Moreover, he was ready for it. When the captain arrived at the scene, she was surprised by the change in the slums. Something in the air had changed, but people still cast wary glances. Unexpectedly, Violetta approached the group and introduced herself as their leader. The night snakes were shocked. They already knew about their visit. They headed for the fake hideout created for such uninvited guests. Roger appeared before them as Mr. He warned them that he had burns on his face and asked them to ignore it. At Tarina's request, he gave his real name, obviously a fictional legend, which the captain immediately sensed. The biography sounded too smooth, as if it were being read from a memorized cheat sheet. But then the conversation got to the point. The disappearance of the Silver Sun. Roger was genuinely surprised why suspicion had fallen on him. After all, many members of that organization had dark pasts. Wasn't the disappearance of such people a tragedy? Why had the Night Serpents suddenly become champions of the criminal's honor? Tarina reminded him that if the suspicion had been serious, her sword would have tasted his blood long ago. The protagonist thanked her for her attention, unexpectedly calmly, considering the threats. This struck Enya. If this man wasn't afraid of even the cruel captain, then he definitely wasn't simple. On this note, the team decided to end the meeting. Roger was not going to see them off. But as soon as they left, someone's mumbling came from behind the door. Their eyes met. Enya and Alex instantly recognized each other. Of course, that's not all. Enya caught up with Alex, hoping to talk, but he aggressively pushed her away, claiming that there was nothing between them. She understood. He hadn't changed at all. Only when the girl left did real sadness appear on Alex's face. However, all his comrades were already standing behind him. Although the hero wanted to come alone, the situation turned out differently. Faced with a surprise, the boy decided to tell everything. Once, a few days before the commencement ceremony, Alex beat up an instructor and fellow students. He was provoked because they could not accept the fact that the commoner had surpassed the aristocrats, and it was impossible to stay among them for another 3 years. Phantos guessed. The point is not in the deduction. He and Enya were dating then. It all started with competitions, practice fights, rivalry, and suddenly the desire to defend instead of win. She felt the same way. Their connection had become special, unforgettable. But Enya was an aristocrat. And the closer they became, the greater the humiliations Alex suffered. The girl didn't even know about it. He was hiding everything for her. And he partly agreed with those insults. Even if he became the best, he would still be an obstacle for her. So he pretended to be a traitor and broke everything up himself. But after that, it only got worse for him. Nothing connected them anymore. It was at that time that Alex was approached by a stranger who knew perfectly well about his strength. He couldn't understand why the boy was putting up with such a life and suggested changing everything. This was the one Alex considered his savior, the leader who picked him up like a lost dog. For him, the protagonist was the only light in a dark world. Elfika only noted that no one really knew anything about their boss. The protagonist resolutely promised to tell everything, but above all, to explain why they were collecting relics. For him, this world was a cage where everyone suffocated, and breaking these shackles became his goal. But he was not going to destroy the beautiful world. It was for the sake of searching for relics that he changed his names, although that was not the only reason. However, before he reveals his real name, it is worth mentioning another event. Renee woke up to find Julia Plumhart next to her. The girl felt a strange energy in the room which brought her here. It turned out that she was drawn to dreams. A special magic allowed her to visit another person's dream to see something important. Julia tried to find out if Renee had dreamed anything unusual. Renee recalled memories from her past youth, peaceful but with a touch of sadness. Plumhart assured her that it was not just a dream, but a flash from the past, an echo of a once-sealed reality. She wanted to repeat the dive, but she couldn't. Even magic proved powerless. This meant only one thing: the memory was a part of her own life, hidden by someone on purpose. To break the seal, Julia asked him to remember at least something specific. Renee remembered the name, Heathcliff. And that's exactly what the protagonist finally called himself. Heathcliff Van Bredis, a descendant of the royal dynasty of the Holy Nation, the son of the previous monarch. Plumhart was unable to pinpoint the identity. The memories were too vague. She was missing details, and Julia's body was beginning to disappear, indicating a quick awakening. Renee wanted to talk to her later, but for Julia, it was a sudden impulse that brought on strong emotions. And if she ever wants a sequel, you'll have to pique her curiosity again. Meanwhile, the protagonist group was feeling dizzy. No one could understand how they ended up being related to a descendant of the imperial dynasty. However, the hero's incredible abilities had nothing to do with his title. He only inherited obsession from his father. But the real reason for the disguise was much simpler. He was hiding from his family in order to stay alive. The former emperor had long since lost his sanity, and from the moment the question of an heir came up, all efforts were directed towards his removal. And just recently, the nobility of Bredis suddenly became active after 20 years of silence, electing a temporary king. After such a shocking truth, it's worth taking a breather. Detective Casey Selmoy continued her own investigation. First the werewolf, then the attack on the auction, then the awakening of the beast of Gévaudan, and of course the appearance of the Black Dawn in Theon. All of this pointed to strange events that were rapidly unfolding in Leatherwalk. But Casey's main target is the Black Dawn. After a series of interrogations, she found out where the key figures were based, in Valtunel. And that's where Moriarty was probably waiting. Roger had no less to do. Gray-haired woman selected the most important news, and an invitation to the Mystic Night appeared. An annual gathering of wizards from all regions. It looked as if the combined association of the old and new magic towers had decided to invite the protagonist as well. At that time, the magical community was divided into 3 camps. The Old Tower, supporters of tradition and magic for the chosen ones. Nova combined magic with science. The third is an association of independent researchers with a completely different approach. Roger himself did not support any of them. The conversation was interrupted by the appearance of Professor Viorano. He came to find out about Sedina's decision, who, without going into an explanation, gave a brief answer and abruptly left the office. The professor only guessed that she didn't seem to like him. And yet, Viorano was genuinely concerned because he saw something in her that was similar to himself. He finally confessed. Sedina's unusual ears indicated her elven origin. This news made Roger think seriously. The protagonist immediately went to the girl. She worked in her own greenhouse. Flowers were her passion. Roger reported Viorano's words and also promised. If Gray-haired wanted to return to the elven community, he would arrange everything. She would have nothing to worry about. The girl wanted to apologize for hiding the truth, but it was Viorano who had confessed it, and now she wanted to stay by his side. In response, Roger admitted that he too had a secret. He briefly stated that he had no connection to the First Order. The news that gray-haired was a half-elf came as a real shock to the protagonist. Her last name is Roshan, which meant that her father was an aristocrat and her mother was an elf. During the race wars, there were rumors that the Roshan family had enslaved elves. If true, then the girl's origins were tragic. Roger asked Professor Virano carefully what it was that he had suggested to his assistant. It turned out that the professor wanted to save her from her family and take her to the elves. Because among humans she was looked down upon, and in the community of half-elves she would feel freer. However, Roger understood that if Virano had no real influence, he would not be able to protect her even among his own people, because she was half-human. But it turned out that the professor was no ordinary man. He was the elder of the community, the head of the Dentist clan, one of the 7 roots of the World Tree. His clan protected not only elves, but also those who grew up far from their homeland, such as gray-haired. But the protagonist could not influence her choice. But Virano had a strong argument. The girl trusted Roger too much, so his support was critically important. That is why the protagonist decided to reveal his secret. Sedina's reaction was sharp. She didn't understand why he had lied for so long. Roger was sorry, but I wanted to hear one thing, whether she followed the First Order because of the calling of her soul, or because of him. The girl admitted that it all started because of the Black Dawn. But why is she still with him? Even though he lied, he honestly admitted that now it was her turn to choose, and Roger will accept any decision. But he knew that her true motive was revenge on her family, and Dawn had simply used her. Gray-haired woman decided to approach the First Order herself, because she always felt superfluous. She didn't like Black Dawn, but John Doe saw something genuine in her, listened and praised her for the first time. Gray-haired woman cried, but did not leave. She didn't know what to do anymore. Roger advised them to just act as they had before, as if they were still part of the Dawn. From that moment on, he needed all the most detailed information. He wanted to destroy the Black Dawn. In addition, Roger decided to trust even more. He introduced the girl to his friends. Gray-haired was a valuable ally, an incredible sorceress, and a true master of gathering information. She was on their side now. Roger also wanted to hear news from Hans. 3 fragments remained to be found. One of them could simply be in the capital city of Lindenbrunn, and another could be in the Debok Fortress, which belonged to the Exilian Empire. And with Sedina's help, they can do anything. And now that Theon has a loyal ally, things will finally move forward, and they will be able to put an end to the history of the Black Dawn. A few days later, the protagonist went to Valtanul. There was an abandoned factory there. The place was familiar to him, but figuring out exactly where the Black Dawn was hiding was not easy. Roger immediately caught a suspicious smell of chemicals in the air. It seems these freaks really did have laboratories with access to the sewers. Casey Selmoy unexpectedly appeared behind him, wondering in surprise what Professor Roger was doing here. The protagonist briefly explained that he was investigating an arson attack at a festival. As it turned out, Casey had the same suspicions. What's more, she sensed a familiar presence while she was wandering around, because her business card was still with him. Casey said without hesitation that she didn't buy into this nonsense. She had been waiting for him here because she was sure he would show up. And the fictional legend only made her convinced that it was not Roger who was standing before her, but James Moriarty. The protagonist calmly dodged her attacks. He was ready to break her neck, but Casey prepared a counterattack. But suddenly a mouse ran past his leg, and the detective's spell instantly disappeared. As it turned out, she was terrified of these creatures. Heathcliff immediately took advantage of this, which was why he didn't want to fight her. Besides, he knew she wouldn't go to the police. Her pride wouldn't allow it. It was because of her that she pursued him alone. But he didn't have time for these cat-and-mouse games. He planned to storm the Dawn's hideout. Casey was stunned. Wasn't he part of this organization? Casey was left dissatisfied, but she had her own methods. She had already accumulated enough mana to use the memory disruption technique and peer into the enemy's past. 30 minutes passed. Almost everyone inside the research lab was dead. The protagonist was looking for records of the experiments, and the only logical place was the safe. But he was stopped by someone's voice. Before him stood a gray-haired scientist who had come to check out the laboratory, but an uninvited guest was waiting for him. This guest turned out to be the First Order, Victor Dreadpool. Heathcliff was about to destroy it as quickly as possible, but the blow was repelled by a golden wall that rose from the ground. It turned out to be a liquid golem, created using alchemy, metallurgy, and all kinds of magic. A true child of science beyond the bounds of common sense. And although the creature focused on him, it didn't protect its master. This was a chance. The protagonist activated a powerful technique and broke through to the scientist. But his attack was stopped by another monster. And then Heathcliff realized that it was some kind of spatial technique. Before him stood another First Order, Verum. Victor Dreadpool was sincerely glad that the Baron had saved him. Heathcliff quickly assessed the situation. This guy was too skilled. Was he really another First Order? Two such monsters at the same time. This was definitely not what he had planned. In addition, Dreadpool immediately understood what spell Roger had used. A spatial leap. The scientist dreamed of solving this secret. But suddenly the Baron unexpectedly attacked the protagonist. Dreadpool didn't hide his displeasure. He wanted an answer. But Verum reminded them that they were dealing with an outsider, and the doctor simply lost his guard. Despite this, Dreadpool still hoped to take him alive. A rare specimen. The protagonist was shocked at how powerful these two turned out to be. It was simply impossible to approach them. The only way out was to retreat. Heathcliff activated the magic of the Eighth Sphere, the Heed technique. Both First Orders survived, of course. However, a surprise awaited Dreadpool. His safe was empty. The Baron didn't understand why he had taken everything and what he was looking for. The protagonist, although he regretted that those monsters did not die, still achieved the main thing. He received a complete data archive. Everything that the Black Dawn once researched. Smokeless gunpowder, experiments on humans using the power of beasts, and also a report on the work on automatons that was carried out in the Kingdom of Delica 3 years ago. These memories still haunted Roger. It was there that he met an exceptional boy. Who would have thought that Dawn was behind all this? But his thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. The rector personally visited the professor. Eliza intended to recommend him for the position of Dean of the Academy, a very influential and weighty role in Theon. She believed that Roger deserved it, because he had done so much for the Institute. However, one recommendation was not enough. Now it was time to prove your competence. The protagonist confidently assured that 1 week would be enough for him to prepare. He has been working on an important project and will soon complete and present it. After that, I immediately went to class. Meanwhile, Renee decided to approach the professor. She couldn't understand something. Every time I looked at him, my heart clenched with a strange feeling. It was as if someone from her past was standing before her. Heathcliff? The protagonist felt as if he had been electrocuted. The professor calmly asked what Renee had just said. The girl immediately started apologizing. She said she hadn't slept well, so it happened by accident. Roger only advised little one to take better care of herself. Sleep and studying were important. Renee was glad that she wasn't asked any unnecessary questions, although somewhere inside an uneasy feeling arose. Meanwhile, Heathcliff posted an advertisement for a scientific project. The research topic concerned synthetic methods of enhancing mana. If everything goes well, the position of head of the dean's office will be his without any competition. The rector still couldn't figure out who Professor Roger really was. And the protagonist was thrown off track by a name that suddenly escaped Renee. It seems like she remembered almost nothing, but it's still worth being careful. She can't remember anything. Moving on to the more interesting stuff, Roger recruited 6 participants for the study. Everyone had to sign a document of complete confidentiality. Julia Plumhart decided to take this opportunity to be close to Sedina. After all, they had been friends since childhood and it was Julia who first opened up to her. But over time, Sedina began to distance herself. Plumhart could see the colors of others' dreams, a reflection of their emotions. Dreams change slowly, so moods don't lie. But after their meeting in Theon, the colors of Sedina's dreams became disturbing. She was mired in darkness. But something had changed that day. Her dreams, while not vivid, were brighter for the first time in a long time. And the only one who could have had such an influence was Professor Roger. But how could he, if he didn't dream at all? That's why Julia was so eager to restore their connection. Before the experiment began, the students' mana levels were measured. Then, 1 dose of the drug is taken weekly. But at the start, there were side effects. Complete loss of control and limitation. No more than 3% of magical potential. And it was in this state that they would begin their training. Spell control and visualization. It was scheduled to begin the very next day. But that very evening, the ring received from the Zero Order suddenly lit up. It seems the Black Dawn meeting has already begun. Heathcliff accepted the invitation, put on the ring, and found himself in a strange space where many figures had gathered at a round table. It seems all the First Order were already here, except for Esmeralda. On the left sat familiar faces. the two he had recently crossed paths with. On the right were strangers. Everyone was waiting for Esmeralda to appear, but Victor Dreadpool remembered that there were rumors of her disappearance. The stranger Nikolai advised me to contact John Doe with this question. The protagonist briefly addressed the Zero Order with a request to clarify everything, and he, as always, unexpectedly appeared. His greeting sounded solemn. After all, a new stage in Heathcliff's life had begun.